All right, hello everyone. So I'm back from the US, except I'm still away from home, as you can see, because now I'm attending a different conference. No, no end of conferences for the wicked, as they say. Actually, no one says that, but anyway, this is the Society for the Neurobiology of Language, and I'm presenting a poster relating to some of my PhD work. But anyway, it's evening now, and I thought, well, I've got a couple of hours. Why not review a video? And there's a video that has been on my radar for, well, I don't know, how long's it been? About 2 weeks, that I thought it might be interesting to review, which is this one. No, well, this one. So this discussion between Sean McDowell and Michael Shermer on, is morality better explained by God or science? Although in the description it says, can morality be explained without God? And those are really very different questions. So I'm not actually sure which question they're going to address here, because I think saying that morality can be explained by science is somewhat of an odd thing to say, depending on how you define science. If you define it in a broad way, then I guess that's fine. But if we're thinking it in a narrow way, like physical science, then I think that that's a bit silly. I haven't watched this before, although I have heard a little bit about what each of them has to say on morality, so we'll see how much that follows over. Don't know how much of the video we'll get to go through this evening, because usually it takes me about 3 or 4 times as long to cover it. And it looks like they're kind of, I don't know if they go to Q&A, so if there's a natural stopping point. I don't see that, but we'll see how we go. Maybe I'll just put it on 125 and we'll get started.
New York Times best-selling author, presidential fellow at Chapman University, Dr. Michael Shermer, one of the most recognizable and influential skeptics today. We had a couple coffee house debates or discussions maybe 15 or 20 years ago, Michael, and I remember that well. I appreciate your thoughtfulness, the way you carry yourself. So I've wanted to have you back for years. My only regret is how long it took, but better late than never. So thanks for coming back on.
Oh, you're welcome. By the way, I was just going through my library here from 1972. I have this book on my shelves.
Wow.
Yeah, that's the 1972 edition. Is that your father?
That is my dad. Yeah.
There he is.
He is younger than I am now.
He's younger than you are now. Yeah, look at that hair. That's the 1970s in that suit.
Oh, man.
You got to love it.
Don't
here's the dedication to the book. To Dottie, my subject.
Okay, this is nice and old.
Years ago, you brought me a signed book of your latest book at the time. I appreciate, and asked me how my dad was doing. I thought that was really just thoughtful.
Right. Okay, I forgot about that. Yeah, is he still with us?
He is 85 years old,
wow.
So he stepped back just for reasons that hit an 85-year-old. But all things considered, he's as healthy as
The Moral Arc. I'm actually not familiar with that. Is that a recent book? No, not really. What's this about? Improving morality over time, kind of pinker kind of stuff. Democracy. Shermer criticizes historical religious justification for slavery, cruelty to animals, misogyny. Okay, I mean, I don't dramatically disagree with anything there. Anyway, I wonder if some of that will come up.
Yes, I think someone could be at 85.
That's great.
Oh.
Nice.
Well, I love that you still have that for so many reasons, and that's a whole nother conversation that we could have. But you sent me a chapter from your book, which I think is a forthcoming book on truth. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the next book is Truth: What It Is, How to Find It, Why It Matters. It's the Johns Hopkins University Press. That'll be about a year from now, fall of 2025. Wanted to avoid.
Geez, Shermer's looking old. How old is he these days? God, I'm pretty sure I met him at a conference years ago. What? Oh, that's not what I want. 54. So what does that make him, like 70? Yeah. Jeez, he's 70 years old. See, I always thought of Michael Shermer as kind of younger. I guess he was younger than like James Randi or someone like that, but oh dear, getting old.
In the election political season of books, because there's a lot on that. But the premise is that there is universal objective reality.
Too bad.
Not only in the physical and biological worlds, but also the human, social.
Yeah, I get that. Shermer's very much not the confrontational sort, at least when it comes to apologetic stuff. Which is fine. I don't necessarily have an issue with different approaches. I mean, I'm not one to be deliberately rude or anything like that, but not one to be like fake chummy either. I mean, I'm not saying that that interaction was fake, but you know, whatever. Different styles for different people.
Moral.
Hopefully, the discussion won't be too cordial because you know that could be a bit boring. Oops.
Worlds. There are facts about the world we can discover. I'm not a cultural relativist, even though I'm an atheist. You know, politically, I'm a libertarian, really socially liberal, fiscally conservative, and so the point I put forth in the book is that there is a truth to be found. There is objective reality we can discover, if not with a capital T truth, but with high or low degrees of probability of a claim being true or not true or undetermined. And so the chapter I sent you on morals,
why do people try to clarify what they're talking about by saying whether it's with a capital letter or a lowercase letter? I never really know what that's supposed to mean. I feel like yeah, this is a nitpick, but I feel like sometimes people don't actually know what they're saying, or at least haven't thought it through clearly, and kind of know that, but to avoid being honest, they use these cliches like, truth, but not with a capital T, as an example of, but what are you actually saying? What is that supposed to mean? And what he just said there about, well, with different levels of probability, that seems to be a claim about knowledge, not about truth, right? Truth presumably is not something that admits of probabilities. I mean, maybe you think that nature is ultimately chancy, like quantum mechanics or something. That's kind of a different point, I think, to what he was talking about. And so you would probably want to say that truth is just like what is, perhaps. At least I think that that's what he was sort of getting at, independently of what anyone thinks about it. And then we can have varying degrees of certainty that we know what that truth is. So we don't have to say anything about whether it's with a capital T. I hope that I hope that they're a bit more careful when they're talking about morality. Again, maybe that's a nitpick of an offhand remark, but then he's writing a book about this, so a little bit of clarity would be nice there. And I do think that it's important when they're talking about these things that we try to be as clear as we can and not use these sort of cliched statements that are kind of weasel words, like they sort of sound like you're saying something, but you're not really saying very much, at least in my opinion. Anyway.
Deal with consciousness and free will and all the big issues. But the moral one seems to be a conundrum for a lot of atheists because they tend to be politically liberal, and therefore they lean toward blank slateism and cultural relativism, and that they can't truly say there's objective moral values and that you can't derive values from facts. But I disagree with all that. There's the is-ought fallacy, the naturalistic fallacy, which I claim is a fallacy. So I call it the naturalistic fallacy.
Yeah.
And, they always turn to Hume as the first person to kind of articulate this. And, but I think when Hume wrote that, you can't derive an ought from an is. For example, the fact that there's been slavery in history doesn't mean that's what we ought to do. That's true. And the fact that there's always been war doesn't mean war is good. That kind of thing. Yeah, okay. But, technically he meant it in a thin sense, as philosophers call it, a thin argument. There are plenty of exceptions, and I like to just take them one by one. Can't we, objectively say that it's better to live in South Korea than North Korea? And you just have to ask.
Depends who you are. For most people, I think that's true. But so coming to the Hume point, again, he didn't go into a lot of detail, so I don't want to overinterpret. But the thing about Hume is, at least the way I understand that argument, and I think that this is the way it's typically understood. I mean, I can't speak for everyone. Hume was making a point about the type of reasoning you're doing, right? You can't deduce an ought claim from a series of is premises. And that's really almost a logical point. Well, no, it is a logical point about the structure of your argument, right? If you just have a series of premises that don't say anything about ought or like morality, then, but your conclusion contains a statement relating to ought or morality, then your argument just is going to have a missing premise there, right? Because at least one of your premises has to link your is statements to an ought statement, and therefore will contain an ought or a moral component to it. So this is just really a logical claim about the structure of an argument, that you can't just list a series of is premises and then arrive at an ought conclusion. You'll be missing a step. At least one of your premises will need to link the ises to the oughts. There's actually nothing, in my view, specific to morality about that. This is true in many domains where if you're sort of crossing from one domain to another, you need to have a linking premise explaining how you're getting from claims in one domain to claims in a different domain. And Hume, I think, was identifying a real issue here, which is that many people inappropriately kind of miss this key linking step. So an example would be if you're going to make a claim about human flourishing, for example, you could make a bunch of claims about well-being or whatever, but somewhere in your premises is going to have to be a claim that morality is about human well-being or promoting human well-being, or it's related to it, or something like that, right? And that's going to be a moral claim, right? That has an ought component. So that will have to be one of your premises, or a component of one of your premises, in order to get the conclusion that you want about morality relating to human well-being, or whatever it is exactly. You've got to link. In order to deductively arrive at a conclusion, you have to link everything together. That's fundamentally what I think Hume was saying. Now, you might not make a deductive argument, in which case this doesn't necessarily apply. Other types of argumentation, like inductive or abductive arguments, don't have to, you don't have to rigorously derive a conclusion from the premises, and therefore there's some more flexibility in how you make the argument. But in terms of the type of argumentation that Hume was talking about, I think he was correct. And what the solution to that, it doesn't mean that you can't have moral realism. It just means that you have to have arguments. If you're going to give a deductive argument for moral realism, you need to ensure that there's at least one moral premise in there that enables you to link whatever it is that you're saying about the natural facts, or that's moral naturalism actually, but links whatever you're saying about the nature of reality with the moral claim you want to make, so that your argument is actually valid and you're not missing a premise. So in my view, the way that Shermer has characterized that is not very accurate. And also, I don't like the way the shadow is casting on my face here. I look kind of silly. I wonder if I can turn off, sorry about this, should have noticed this before. I wonder if that will help. Maybe I'll just turn this on. This is what happens when you're in a different setup. Okay, I think that looks slightly better. A bit of a harsh overhead light. Okay, let's move on.
Ask people where they'd rather live, and they'll tell you, yeah, I'd rather live in South Korea than North Korea. So can we say that democracies are truly better than autocracies? I mean, objectively, measurably, absolutely, whatever word description you want to use or criteria, yeah, we can. And I don't see any problem with saying that. And so I just see how far I can go in this chapter and in the book in general with that idea. That is, there's an objective reality, and universal, whatever you want to call it, universal realism, we call it, and that we can discover something about it, if not perfectly, because we're all fallible beings. By the way, I start off with the premise that that define, if there is a God, it's an omniscient, omnipotent being. But one thing I know for sure is I'm not God, and neither are you. So none of us knows anything for sure. Fallibilism is one of the premises. So, we have to start there and say, but that doesn't mean everything is relative. That doesn't mean your opinion is as good as mine, or this indigenous people's origin story is as good as the scientific origin story, or whatever, or that your race or gender identity determines the truth about reality. No, there's actual objective truth out there, separate from you and I and our culture and our upbringing and our.
Yeah, Shiv is just kind of rambling here, in my opinion. So obviously, if you don't believe in any kind of notion of mind-independent truth, then you're not really going to be a moral realist. That kind of doesn't make sense. But you can be a realist about other types of facts or domains without being a moral realist. So it's not like that establishing that there is objective truth about some things is really that relevant to establishing moral realism, unless the person you're talking to doesn't believe that there's any type of mind-independent truth or facts. I generally prefer to talk about facts rather than truth, but it doesn't matter that much. Yeah, and he mentioned the word universal, which is a bit of a different thing in my view. It's just all of a bit of a jumble here. I've heard Shermer talk about, the way I've heard Shermer talk in other cases is similar to this, where it feels like it's a bit of a brain dump. There's some ideas here, but it's sort of a bit unclear how they're supposed to be connected. It's pretty clear that Sean McDowell is not going to be arguing for relativism. So maybe let's focus on, well, I mean, hopefully we will, but even so, why bother talking about this in this context where it just doesn't seem like it's a point of disagreement, and he's not really going into any depth about what relativism even is or why certain people advocate for it. Though it's pretty hard to find any philosophers who seriously advocate for like global relativism. Generally, there might be people, yeah, there are people who are like subjectivists about morality, for example, or sometimes other domains, but it's pretty hard to find anyone who actually argues for that across the board. But anyway, so I don't
whether we're
he's arguing
Westerners or
against it,
not,
really.
whatever.
Sure. That's really helpful. I appreciate you sending me the chapter. When the book is out in a year, let's have a conversation about that.
Okay, so we're not
But I think
talking
it's
about
helpful
that.
to focus down on the
Oh,
question of
geez.
moral truth that you highlighted.
Okay, yes.
And one of the
Making
questions I
sure.
was going to ask you is what
Focus
you
here.
thought we had in common. And from what I
sure.
can tell, I think we have in common, although we differ over how to get there and probably will challenge each other's position. We both are not relativists. We both claim to be moral realists. In your chapter on the science of good and evil, I think we also agree. You're like, we kind of have our better angels and our worse angels. We're capable of the Holocaust, but we're capable of altruism. We both reject the blank slate approach. And I think you and I probably on most ways of
blank
knowing
slate
right.
has to do with this. He mentioned that before as well. Like, it could be the case that blank slate. So that I take it as a denial of human nature, like a substantive human nature. That just seems to be irrelevant to the question of whether moral realism is true or not. I don't understand the connection there. I mean, even if humans have no innate nature, that we could still socialize them to be good or bad, right? I don't know. It just seems completely irrelevant.
Right and wrong, apart from the Bible, of course, whether it's through experience, reflection, asking people. I think for the most part, if we live our lives, Michael, you and I would agree about how we know right and wrong. Before we go further, did I miss anything in terms of not issues like we probably disagree on abortion, maybe immigration? I have no idea, but our ethical systems, did I miss anything you think we maybe have in common?
Yeah, that seems pretty thorough. I would say just in terms of like recent events in the last few years with the rise of Islamic terrorism and so on, Richard Dawkins and I have been talking about this of being kind of cultural Christians, even though he and I are atheists, that the Western world that has adopted Judeo-Christian values, that it also includes democracy and free market capitalism and
Shermer buys into that crap.
The Bill of Rights and so forth, the concept of rights. We're all children of the Enlightenment. That is a better worldview than other worldviews, such as Middle Eastern Islamic countries and theocracies that don't acknowledge the rights, say, of women or LGBTQ people and so forth. And so when this conversation came up because Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's a famous atheist, has become a Christian. You probably are aware of this. She had a conversion. In part, it was because of personal experiences she had dealing with personal problems, and that Christianity helped her out. But then she's gone further to say it's also a better worldview for our society. And so Richard and I have kind of said, yeah, okay, if you mean by comparison, living in a theocracy like an Islamic country, yeah, sure, okay, that's fine. Yeah, so we may have some common ground in the sense that Christianity did go through the Enlightenment, and it came out the other end much more rational, liberal, tolerant, and so on. I mean,
sorry, I wanted to get what he was saying there, but he sort of just goes on and on. I am really surprised that Shermer believes those things, right? Because I always thought of him as being a pretty, kind of liberal, enlightened kind of guy, which I think he would agree with, and he was embracing those claims there, right? But what's interesting to me is that he apparently buys into this whole Judeo-Christian values nonsense, which mostly has been advanced by people on the conservative right. Sort of ironically, the very people who oppose the Enlightenment or many aspects of it. Arguing that there's some fundamental difference between Islam and Christianity, or other religions for that matter, and sort of arguing that, well, the West, with its Judeo-Christian values, is in a superior position relative to, he said Middle Eastern Islam, which is already a bit of an odd term. Most Muslims don't live in the Middle East, so I'm not sure if there's something worse about Islam in like Egypt compared to, or Turkey compared to Indonesia, or I mean, there are better and worse Muslim countries to live in, certainly, but I'm not sure what he meant by the Middle Eastern part. Anyway, okay, so some people say that actually, let me take a step back. So it's definitely true that there are many progressive post-Enlightenment forms of Christianity which have a much more pro-science, pro-progress, pro-human rights, and status of women and other such traditional minorities or oppressed peoples. It's absolutely true that there are many sects within Christianity that have a much better position on that than they did a few centuries ago, before the Enlightenment and all sorts of things that happened since then. It's also true that that hasn't happened to the same extent in many Muslim countries. Now, is that because of Islam? I suspect that it's more to do with the governments that those countries have had than anything intrinsic to Islam, but that's obviously a very difficult discussion to have, because how do you know what the counterfactual is? But the point I wanted to make rather was that this idea that it's something about Judeo-Christian values that gave rise to human rights and science and the Enlightenment and all that sort of stuff. Again, if you look at the history, the people who were promoting Enlightenment values were generally theists. It's true, there weren't many atheists, at least at first, but they were very explicitly and consciously acting against and pushing against the position of the church and the traditional religious authorities, and often state authorities which had a close relationship with the church, like the French kings and the Catholic Church, for example, or the Pope in Italy, or the Habsburgs and the Catholic Church, or the British monarchy and the Church of England, and so forth, right? They were very consciously pushing against that and arguing for the secularization of politics and the rationalization of public discussions of policy, and removal of religious dogma from science and philosophy and historical analysis and these sorts of things. And it took a very long time for them to get these for these perspectives to become widely accepted. The idea that somehow they're that theocracy is an Islamic thing, I mean, yes, I don't think there are any Christian theocracies currently in the world today. Okay, you say, well, the Church of England typically is a state. Yeah, but it's not really a theocracy, right? Although I would say some people are trying to get us back in that direction in certain countries, but let's hope that doesn't happen. And there are countries like Iran, which is very clearly a theocracy. So yes, there are cases like that, but you don't have to go back very far before you see some pretty explicit theocracies. I mean, one of the most recent examples in Europe would probably be Francoist Spain, which, if not exactly a theocracy, was quite close to it, because there was a very close relationship between the Catholic Church and the Francoist regime, and a very explicit effort to promulgate a traditional Catholic view on the family and the state and society and all that sort of stuff, and very much not a pro-Enlightenment view. And that was only 50 years ago in Spain, right? We also see in Russia today that there is a similar mutually parasitic relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Putinist regime, and efforts to call back to, well, simultaneously call back to aspects of the Soviet past, but then also the Russian Empire and Orthodox Christianity and the Russian state. It's all a bit of a kludge, in my opinion, but there's obviously political reasons for that. I think when people say Judeo-Christian values, they implicitly exclude the Orthodox branch of Christianity. I'm not really sure why, because it's are they less Christian somehow? But then they also kind of forget about the very anti-secular Catholic regimes that often existed until quite recently in the south of Europe. And they also forget about how anti-Enlightenment many of at least the earlier Protestant rulers were. That's maybe changed over the years. But anyway, the point is, an honest and clear look at European history, I think, shows that there's been, just as, at least until, at least pre-World War II, there's been just as much theocracy and anti-Enlightenment conservative pushback from religious spheres as there was in the Islamic world, or at least comparable amounts, right? And indeed, as there was in many other parts of the world, like in India and in China. In all of these cases, traditional political and religious or spiritual elites opposed Enlightenment ideas and reforms because they threatened the status quo. You can see this everywhere with a reaction of the rulers and the cultural and economic elites to the Enlightenment. It's not somehow that it was adopted with open arms in the West and then everyone else refused to, particularly in the Islamic world. In fact, if you look back even 50 years ago, much of the Islamic world was secularizing quite rapidly. You can see photographs in 1970s Kabul and Tehran in particular, of women just going about wearing Western clothing, no veiled, were able to acquire education, at least for middle class women. Obviously, there were still relatively poor countries, but the modern highly regressive regimes, at least in those two countries, are relatively recent, only dating to like the 1979 or the 1990s in the case of the Taliban. And there's been a recent sort of resurgence of very traditional and very conservative Islamist regimes and movements in many of those countries. That's quite a recent phenomenon. I mean, those ideas have been around for a while, but their sort of resurgence relative to the secular regimes, especially in the Arab world, which dominated in like the 60s and 70s, is a relatively recent phenomenon. And there's there's specific political and social reasons for that. Anyway, I'm getting a bit off track. The point is that this whole rhetoric about the Judeo-Christian values are important to save the West and whatever, I'm really shocked that Shermer is actually buying into that crap. Because from my point of view, obviously the West does have part of its heritage is Christianity, and there's no denying that, and that's had important influences on the culture, as have many other things, including the pre-Christian Greco-Roman heritage, ideas from Judaism, important influences from the Islamic world, particularly throughout the Middle Ages, and then more recent influences of the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers that are explicitly moving away from traditional Christian ideas. So there's many components intellectually and politically and socially that contribute to making up the modern West. Identifying the things that we like and calling them Judeo-Christian values, I think, is just complete nonsense and is completely ahistorical and doesn't really seriously engage with any of the actual history or a comparative analysis of what happened in other countries. And it's kind of disappointing to hear Shermer just repeating this nonsense as well. Anyway, so isn't Shermer a borderline anti-woke culture warrior of sorts? I think so, though I don't want to say too many specific things because I'm not entirely sure the details of what he's been sharing. But I mean, an example would be what we just talked about, the whole Judeo-Christian values thing, right? Because typically, I mean, people like Hersey Ali, right? Like that's an example that Shermer just mentioned. She was sort of anti-woke, and then partly, I guess, because of the company she was keeping or the ideas that she was interacting with, went full into, well, not only do we need to safeguard Judeo-Christian cultural values, but we actually need to become Christians, or at least she felt the need to. That may not be the only reason, but you read her explanation for this, it's definitely a major reason for why she did that. So yes, there does seem to be an intellectual current here which, in opposition to certain progressive ideas, which I've critiqued some of myself, right? I don't call myself anti-woke, but I did a video with Nathan where we talked about some of these things, and I'm critical of some ideas that are associated with that label. But then in opposition to that, then we do see seemingly an increasing number of people actively like flirting with or actively adopting a set of pretty just explicitly conservative cultural ideas, which I think is kind of a problem, actually. So hopefully Shermer's not going too far in that direction. I hadn't heard a lot about it, but I mean, from what he said here, anyway.
The Christianity of the Middle Ages in the early modern period before the Enlightenment, was not what we would call a liberal, tolerant religion. I mean, the anti-Semitism and the pogroms against the Jews and
so on. The anti-Semitism didn't stop with the Enlightenment. I mean, yes, that did help to lead to Jewish emancipation in certain countries, but the anti-Semitism didn't go away. It still hasn't gone away. It's true that it's much less accepted than it was even 100 years ago, when it was just accepted that most people were anti-Semitic in most parts of, especially continental Europe. But anyway, to attribute that to Christianity, I think is ridiculous. Christianity existed in the West for like nearly 2,000 years before the Enlightenment, and then somehow it was Christianity that caused the Enlightenment. He didn't say that, but he did say Judeo-Christian values. By the way, what the heck is a Judeo-Christian value? Through all that time, the Christians hated the Jews, right? Anyway, I don't want to get off on that tangent, but it's such nonsense.
The witch crazes and all that was not good. But
good, yeah.
But it changed. So one of my theses is that religion changes with the changing times, and that we've all had our moral sphere expanded to include more people as honorary members of our in-group, and therefore we're more tolerant of them. And everybody in the West has done. Now, what's the cause of that? You know, Christians will say, well, that's because of, you know, Christianity. I argue in the moral arc. No, it's actually the result of rational arguments. But that aside,
okay, so he doesn't think that it was Judeo-Christianity. So what was he talking about with Judeo-Christian value stuff? Like, I would say it's Enlightenment values, which yes emerged in a Christian context, but are not themselves Christian. There may be certain Christian antecedents, but you can also see antecedents to the ideas in many other traditions as well. Anyway, he seems to be saying conflicting things here. Maybe he'd say, read my book. Well, maybe I will. I don't know.
View.
He didn't express it very well.
The idea of forcing women to wear the burqa or forcing them to undergo female genital mutilation. I'm willing to go out on a limb and go, that is wrong. I mean, it is morally, ethically wrong, objectively wrong. It's absolutely wrong, and I could give you arguments for why. But back to where we started, most of my fellow atheists would say, well, no, we can't say it's wrong. And I just find this flabbergasting.
What's the evidence for the claim that most atheists are going to say we can't say that, let's say, female genital mutilation is wrong? Everyone in the West says that that's wrong. Like, you know, pretty much everyone. And the funny thing is, even people who aren't moral realists will say that it's wrong. Again, typically, this is something that I find most people who reject. I mean, I'm a moral realist. People on this watching this should know that because I've defended it many times. And I will continue to defend it. But many people like Shermer, who defend moral realism, don't understand or don't appear to understand what moral anti-realists actually say, because they don't just say, or at least the thoughtful ones, there's always thoughtless people everywhere, but the thoughtful ones don't just say, oh no, we can't say that, you know, female genital mutilation is wrong. They just say, well, when we say that it's wrong, we mean something different to what you mean, right? We interpret that that discourse, that practice differently. Maybe we interpret it as, I mean, there's different ways to do it, right? Interpreting it as an injunction or an emotional claim or a culturally relative claim. There's all sorts of ways of understanding that kind of discourse. But the point is, everyone agrees that you say that. Like, everyone agrees, yes, it's wrong. It's just when they disagree about the meta-ethical theory that explains what makes it wrong or what it means for it to be wrong. And that's where they differ from the moral realists. So I don't know who Shermer's talking to when he's saying that all these atheists are saying that you can't say that female genital mutilation is wrong. Maybe there are people who say that, but I think even by far the majority of anti-moral realist philosophers would agree that it's wrong, right? They just understand that claim differently. Well, yeah, I mean, this is the point, right? So even if they wouldn't say it's capital, yeah, it's not capital W wrong, but does Shermer think they wouldn't try to stop it? And this is exactly the point, right? So typically, again, moral anti-realists will say that it's wrong, and they will try to stop it. It's just ask them to unpack that claim, or like, what does it mean in your view for it to be wrong? They will disagree that there is a mind-independent, objective fact of the matter that in virtue of which that makes it wrong, but they'll say it's wrong in virtue of something else, something that's not a mind-independent objective fact. And so people like me and Shermer will disagree with that, and will say, well, we think that there is a mind-independent fact of the matter about that makes it right or wrong. But what we don't disagree on is the normative statement that it is wrong. Right? We just disagree about the status of that normative statement. This is not really a complex idea. But yet somehow many popular defenders of moral realism, including many Christian apologists, by the way, but also apparently Michael Shermer, don't understand what moral anti-realists even claim. And again, even if it's not a position I agree with, I still really object to positions not being appropriately characterized. It's the same with postmodernism, and it's the same with like the video of Mormonism and Islam. I don't like when positions are incorrectly characterized, and that leads to lazy thinking.
I mean, they may say, well, I personally don't think it's good. Well, yeah, I would hope so. But, you know, can't you go better? Can't you do better than that? I mean, how about ask the women? You know, how about that as just kind of a basic moral starting point? Ask the person who's going to be affected how they would feel if this was done to them. You can't just ask yourself, how would I feel? You know, the golden rule. You have to go further than that. You know, take the point of.
Well, so again, so that is not, depending on how you characterize that, the feelings of the person affected by something is not actually, that wouldn't be sufficient to ground a moral realist claim, right? Because the idea of moral realism is that the claim about something being morally wrong is made true, or is true in virtue of a mind-independent or some set of mind-independent facts. Mind independence is important because that's what makes it objective. The difference between objective and subjective is whether the the fact is made true by a subject, so a person, an agent who evaluates something, or whether it's made true by something be outside of a subject, that is objects, right? So if it's just the evaluation of each person affected by something that determines its moral status, then that wouldn't really count as moral realism. Now, there's versions of moral realism that can kind of build on that, but you have to do further work. Anyway, this is just by way of emphasizing that I don't think Shermer's really thought carefully about this or read much about this, given what he said here.
Point of view of the person who's being affected, and then go from there.
So that's helpful. There's a million things there. And separate issue, I would agree with you on the cultural value of certain Christian ideas. I would challenge the narrative, I think, that maybe you told about working through the Enlightenment, but that is a conversation for another time. I think we do share that common ground in certain cultural values. So let's keep going. One more question about your worldview. It wasn't clear as I was reading your stuff. I want to know, would you consider yourself a materialist? Because you said earlier about truth, you said like biological and physical things exist. Can the world be reduced down to particles in motion and matter? Or are there immaterial things that really exist? Because I know even atheists differ on this. Are you a materialist or not?
Yeah, mostly I'm a materialist reductionist, but there are Platonic ideas like the laws of nature and the ideas of God or righteousness or right, justice, goodness, truth. These are ideas also that are not material. So I guess we could get into what is consciousness, because it's not a material thing, although I think of it as an emergent property of material.
Has Shermer read anything in philosophy? I don't like being an elitist, right? But it's just, he says Platonic idea. What did he say? Ideals or ideas? Before I critique, I should clarify.
These are ideas also that are
not. No, he clearly said ideas. Okay, so if you're a materialist if you're a materialist, you generally think the mind is material, right? I suppose that there's property dualism, in which you say that that there's only one physical substance, like the stuff in the brain, but there are properties that are mental, that are not physical. That position I often find a little bit hard to understand about what it means for something to be a non-physical property. So maybe Shermer could be something like that. But anyway, the point is, if he's saying that Platonic ideas like numbers or laws of nature are not physical, then he's not really a materialist. Like he's a Platonist, and that's, I would say, not a form of materialism. I think materialists really need to be nominalists about abstractions. Maybe that could be a definitional point, but generally speaking, a materialist is someone who believes that everything that exists is physical. And if you're then going to say that Platonic forms exist but are not physical, then I don't think you're a materialist. But then the other thing is that if you're a materialist about the mind, then you would say that ideas are physical. And he seems to be saying that ideas are not physical, which is odd for a materialist to say, because if you're not materialist about like numbers or minds, then what kind of materialist are you? This seems to be not really much of a materialist. And then he started talking about what was
material. So, I guess we could get into what is consciousness, because it's not a material thing.
And consciousness isn't material either, right? So consciousness is material, ideas aren't material, and laws of nature aren't material. Okay, there are people who've defended all those positions, but then you can't then call yourself a materialist. Like, come on, what kind of materialism is that? It's like the lamest form of materialism. Now, maybe there's a way to make all that make sense, but I'm not really seeing it from what he said here.
Although I think of it as an emergent property of material stuff, neurons firing in certain.
Yes, but you can be. Emergence is a position about the relationship, in this case, of like the mind and the brain. It's not a position about whether the mind is material or not. It's a view about the relationship of those two things. You could believe that the mind is emergent and non-material, or it's emergent and material. It depends on other positions, right? The point is, emergence versus reductionism is really a separate question or set of questions from the issue of whether you're a materialist about the mind or not. And again, this is an example of the sort of weasel words here. Emergentism, I think, or emergence is one of these. I'm generally critical of the term broadly because I think that it's overused. But particularly in this case, it seems like Shermer wants to say that the mind isn't or ideas or whatever, consciousness, that those things aren't material. But he also wants to say that they come from material things in some sense. So he throws out the word emergence, as if that really addresses anything. Now, you can appeal to emergence, I think, in order to explain the relationship, say, between mind and brain. I'm not a big fan of it myself. You can do that, but you need to think about what that word is doing and what it means, right? I think what Shermer would actually want to say here is that the mind is physical, but mental events or processes, or maybe properties, are an emergent phenomenon from physical properties of the brain. Again, there's property dualism, so maybe he's leaning into that. That often property dualists talk about emergence, so perhaps that's what he's saying there. But we're lacking some clarity there, so it's a bit hard to tell. Because property dualists say, yeah, there's only the substance is material, but the properties are immaterial. So maybe that's the closest to what. Microphone just conked out, so I'll have to use this one. Oh dear. Let me just plug these headphones in. Sorry. Not going well this evening, is it? I hope that I can still hear the video. I might just have to mute myself. Hopefully you can still hear me. It might just be like kind of crap, because I presume that it's defaulted to the webcam. All right, anyway, let's keep going.
And patterns and so on. From that, you get consciousness, and that from that derives ideas. So those ideas, this is a debatable point. Platonic ideas, logic, is it out there in the universe somewhere and we're discovering it, or are we just completely making this up? Well, I think it's both. I think if there were extraterrestrial intelligences, they would discover the same rules of logic, the same laws of physics and biology, and really society. If they're subject to evolution, they're going to have the same kind of motives and emotions we have, or at least something similar. And those they would call something, whatever the words they would use would be different, but they would be similar to our concepts. So I do think ideas exist out there separately from material stuff.
Okay, so ideas exist, like
How can ideas exist without a mind or brain to think about them? I just think he hasn't thought through what he's saying here. There's ways to reformulate it, but at that point, I'm just doing all the work for him. Yeah, let's just keep going.
Real, like they have properties and they exist. It's one thing to say you write a book with ideas in it, but things like justice and virtues, moral obligations, do those things exist if no human beings existed? Or are they dependent on our brains and don't really have independent Platonic existence in some sense?
Yeah. Just the lone survivor on a desert island there's really no morality there. Morality involves interactions with other people. So I would say it requires sentient beings of some kind. If there were no, I guess I would say that. Yeah, it requires sentience.
Fair enough. Just trying to get clarification. So one of the things you talked about in the article, I think is helpful. I think we can jump in and kind of go back and forth on this and flesh this out a little bit, is the is-ought, you call it fallacy. And I wonder if you could explain as briefly as you can what you think the fallacy is, and then we'll come back to unpacking and discussing it. What is the fallacy?
Well, the fallacy here, I'll read to you what the philosopher Robert Pennock wrote me, because when I went about this, debunking this myth of the is-ought fallacy. I'm not a philosopher, so I thought I better have somebody who does this for a living read my stuff. So here's what we wrote. He wrote to me. The way the argument works is to say, if you want to get a moral conclusion, you need at least one moral premise. It's not that there.
Hey, that's exactly what I said, but that is completely different to what Shermer said. But okay, he's saying it now, so let's keep going.
Aren't factual premises, and this I took to be your main point, that science gives us some moral premises that make a difference, and that's exactly right. But the naturalistic fallacy doesn't say you can't have factual premises. It says you can't have only factual premises. You have to have something that has an ought, and such that together with the is, you can get an ought in the conclusion. And I would say that that the way to make your argument is actually bringing in oughts into your premises, and so you're not actually denying the naturalistic fallacy. Okay, really you're accepting it, but building in some ought premises from the beginning, and that's the right way to do it. So I guess my built-in oughts from the beginning is that.
So you just read a quote from a philosopher who I think got it pretty much exactly right, which says, yes, the naturalistic fallacy is a thing, or the is-ought fallacy is a thing, but it means this specific
it makes this specific point, and therefore it's not an argument against moral realism. It's just an argument against certain sloppy arguments for it, or for particular moral claims that don't have a linking premise that includes some kind of normative component. So Shermer just reads that out and then says, okay, well, so I'm not really disagreeing with the naturalistic fallacy, but then why are you saying that you are? Why are you saying it's a fallacy, the naturalistic fallacy? And then you read out a quote that completely demolishes that. What's going on here? Like, he chose that quote to read out on this program, knowing that it completely undermines what he's saying. Huh? What's going on? Come on, Shermer, you're better than this. Maybe he's not. Yeah, it's like literally he reads an expert's view out loud, which says the opposite of what he was saying, but he just still goes on to make up his own idiosyncratic version anyway. What?
That sentient beings.
Okay, can I jump in just for a second, just for clarity, people watching? Here's essentially, I pulled up a text on meta ethics, and they said, here's an example of the is-ought fallacy. It is true that smoking is harmful to your health. Therefore, you ought not smoke. It doesn't follow from the premise that smoking is harmful, that somebody ought not smoke. Getting an ought from a description. Now, hang on. What we need is some additional premise that we are committed to the health and flourishing and moral good of a human being. Then we can move to the ought. But the mere observation that smoking itself causes harm, the is, doesn't give us any ought. And so oftentimes the argument is made that science describes the way the world is, chemistry, physics, biology, but that doesn't carry with any sense of oughtness of what we ought to do and how we ought to behave. As you know, you can't get a prescriptive claim from a descriptive claim. That's the is-ought fallacy. So this is where you differ with it. So maybe explain to me why.
And so Hume also emphasized, as have other commentators, that the is-ought fallacy is just as much a problem for divine command theorists as it is for someone like Shermer, who's trying to argue for a grounding of morality in science. Because let's take the example that John McDowell just had there. If our first premise was God commands you not to smoke, and the conclusion was therefore you ought not smoke, that is just as much of an example of the naturalistic fallacy or the is-ought fallacy as the version that Sean McDowell just gave, right? Because the statement that God commands that you shouldn't do something, or God commands you not to do something, that's just a factual claim. That's a claim about, it's an is claim. It's a claim about something in reality, right? It doesn't actually contain any normative component itself. Like God says that you, God forbid you to do this or something, or God says that you shouldn't do this. We need the extra premise that if God says something, if God tells you not to do something, then you ought to do it. We need that linking premise. So if Shermer is smart here, and we're not going to get through the whole video tonight, maybe I'll do a part 2 on this, but if Shermer was smart, then he'd raise this issue, that this is-ought fallacy is just as much of an issue for any attempt to ground moral claims. And what it's asking us for effectively is to give a good justification as to why our is claims should be linked to the ought conclusions. It requires us to give a theory of metaethics to link those. And so this is just as incumbent on the theist as it is on the non-theist. But it's often presented by theists as if it somehow only applies to the atheist, right? The atheist has to give an explanation as to why, say, human flourishing or well-being is related to morality, but then somehow the theist just gets away without having to explain why God's commands relate to morality, because they just assume that obviously there's a connection there, which is precisely the fallacy that Hume was pointing to, and precisely the same fallacy is just assuming that human well-being has something to do with morality without giving you explanation, without adding those premises in. So I don't know if they're going to actually address that in this discussion. I suspect that they won't, because I don't think that Shermer understands this well enough to bring it up. But it's very frustrating when Hume's point here is deployed as if it's some kind of argument, as if it's some kind of knockdown against an atheistic morality, when in fact it's really a very specific point about the logical form of arguments used to derive moral conclusions, and applies just as equally to any type of ethical claim, regardless of whether it's appealing to God's commands or human well-being or something else. Sometimes I listen to podcasts like that, and it seems like they're just doing philosophy for killing time in an episode. If we feel an episode we succeeded, even if the focus was a mess. Yeah, I think that happens too often. Oh, hang on.
let me read what you wrote. This might help us have some context. It's from the article you sent me.
Yeah.
You said, if the survival and flourishing of individual sentient beings is the foundation of values and morals, then we can say objectively and absolutely that ending poverty is real moral progress. Now, a couple lines later, you say, why is it better? Because it is in our nature to prefer flourishing to suffering. So it seems to me as I'm reading this, I would argue, and obviously you push back, that you are committing the is-ought fallacy by assuming a certain ought that's not a part of your system itself. How do you justify that ought scientifically or philosophically from within naturalism?
Yeah, nice. So what you're saying with the smoking example is correct. I am starting from the beginning point saying people ought to, the ought I'm building in there is human health and flourishing, and that cigarette smoking will decrease that. So yeah, that's my built-in ought. So you and Panak have both correctly identified that I'm not deriving moral oughts just from ises. I'm starting with a starting point, the survival and flourishing of sentient beings. Okay, but even that, you see, I'm saying that's not just some random thing I plucked out of the air. That's a derivative of the laws of nature, evolution, physics, entropy. The second law of thermodynamics, as you read in that chapter, leads to entropy. Everything is running down. So the first purpose of life is to push back against entropy, to carve out a little niche of order, to find food to eat, to find shelter, to find a mate, and so on. And that's what evolution, really natural selection, designed us to do. Here I'm crediting Tooby and Cosmides with this idea. Let me see if I can find their quote here, that it's the second law of thermodynamics is the first law of life, that some kind of basic thing it's about, but it's not flourishing from science and reason.
I guess I would say, I don't know that we need science to tell us that we care about human flourishing. I think it's somewhat obvious, and you'd probably
you just look around. Sure.
Agree with me on that. Yeah, just look around history. It's kind of obvious, but it's not clear to me why that's obligatory within a naturalistic system. So the way you described it is, sure, look around us. We have feelings that we want to survive. We have feelings that we want to flourish. But why are those feelings obligatory in terms of how I should care about anybody else's flourishing and act A versus B? That's a thing that I think is getting muzzled into the system that is not justified by the system itself. So I agree with you. If the survival and flourishing of individual sentient beings is the foundation of values and morals, then ending poverty is real moral progress. But it's not clear within naturalism why that's grounded and how that purpose, which is not a material thing, right? Purpose is not physical. Obligations are not physical. They're not a part of the natural universe. Why that exists and why I have any obligation to follow that. That's what's not clear to me within a naturalistic system in a way I think theism grounds that naturally.
Probably shouldn't have used the word naturally there, but yeah, well, this is often, well, I feel like I should comment there, but that last point, theism grounds that naturally. Well, how though? You're just going to say God says so, or even if you say it's part of God's nature, those are still just is claims, right? We're going to need a claim that links those things or that explains why those are morally relevant, just as much as you need a claim about why human well-being is morally relevant. And just to say where you get a claim like that from, I mean, I think you have to do a conceptual analysis of the notion of morality. What is moral discourse? What do moral terms refer to? How are they used? And then you come up with a theory that best accounts for that set of discourse, that set of ideas, right? We need to say what is morality about before we can say what grounds morality, what makes the moral claims true, if anything. And so you basically develop a theory, a meta-ethical theory about the nature of morality and moral claims, and then that will point you to what it is in reality, if anything, again, that makes those claims true. So you do a philosophical sort of conceptual analysis of morality, moral terms, moral discourse, and you argue for your theory like you do for any other philosophical theory. That's what you need to do. That's called doing meta-ethics. It's not like this is a new idea. People have been doing it for a long time. The problem is, I think that, well, McDowell at least knows about meta-ethics. I don't know that Shermer does. But anyway, maybe I'm being a bit unfair. But what you can't do is then just sort of say, well, just sort of wave it away like Shermer is by saying, well, I'm just sort of assuming this. Well, you can do that, but you're not really doing meta-ethics at that point. You're just doing something else. You're doing applied ethics or normative ethics or whatever. But Shermer seems to be thinking that he is saying something substantive about the nature and ground of morality. I mean, you can't do that if you're just going to wave away how you got to your theory, what justifies your theory. But the same thing applies to McDowell as well, even though he may be aware of meta-ethics. If he's just going to say, oh, well, that just happens naturally under theism, well, how? We need an explanation. We need the same type of explanation as to the nature of the theory and what supports it, as we do from the naturalist or from anyone else, right? Advocating any theory about the nature of ethics. We need an explanation as to what the theory is, how it's supposed to work, and what reasons we have for adopting it. You just got to do your meta-ethics, right? All of that doesn't go away just by appealing to God. You've got to explain how it's supposed to work. And if you advocate for a form of divine command theory, I don't know that McDowell does. I suspect that he does. Most of the people that he shares opinions with also do. I think you run into a host of problems. I mean, any view has some problems, but far more problems in my view than the moral naturalist does. I think divine command theory is a terrible meta-ethical theory. But we need to actually get to discussing that instead of just being, and this is one of the things that really bugs me about these grounds of morality debates. Look, whether you're a moral realist or not, you have to acknowledge, in my view, you should acknowledge that we need to have a fair comparison. That you can't just let the theists have the high ground of claiming that they have an automatic grounding of morality without having to do the work, right? Anyone who's advocating for a theory of meta-ethics, be they like a moral naturalist like myself, or an anti-realist, or a divine command theorist, or something else, they need to do the work and explain why we should accept their view, why it's the best view of ethics and how it makes sense of things and what grounds the claims. You've got to do the work, right? You don't just get it for free. And so what annoys me is that often the atheists or the skeptics in these discussions don't know enough about what they're talking about to hold the Christians to the same standard, and then just let them get away with making all these claims for free. And I think Shermer appears to be doing that here, and I've seen that in many other discussions as well, like with William Lane Craig when he makes his moral argument. Not everyone, there have been a few good philosophers who push back on this, but many of the people just sort of let him make these claims for free, and don't hold him to the same standard that Craig holds other people to when he's asking them to justify their meta-ethical views. We need to ask the apologists and the Christians to justify their meta-ethical views just as much. And when you do that, I think, and when you pursue the discussion, you find that their views have even more problems than the atheistic views. Yeah, this is what I was saying. I take back what I said about Sean. He's only doing well because Sean doesn't know how to push back. Well, I think Sean McDowell is among the better tier of apologists. That may not be saying very much because I generally have quite a low view of apologists, but I would rank him higher than many that I've seen. I think he is more intellectually honest. That being said, I think he does say dumb things sometimes. So it'd be interesting here if he does say something about how he grounds his meta-ethical view. But I don't know that Shermer's going to push back appropriately, so we'll see.
Well, first of all, I don't see how theism does that, but we could get back to that in a minute. What I'm saying is that evolution designed us as survival machines to push back against entropy and all the ways that we can die and suffer and so forth.
I don't actually care about this part because I don't think you can derive moral naturalism from just evolution. There's some aspects there that may be relevant, but I'm sort of not really interested in this. So I'm really keen if we can get back to the point about how theism does it. And Shermer just goes on and on and on. Okay, let's see if they get back to that point.
That's helpful. First off, Christians have been calling me Josh for 48 years. So now atheists are calling me. I'm in trouble, man.
Sorry.
I'm totally kidding. It's fine. No problem at all. Proud of my dad. So there was a lot there. Let me pick apart a few things. You said evolution designed us. I would say, and I assume you agree with this, that evolution is a material, unguided process itself. It's a physical process that happened to result in human beings that feel a sense of purpose, caring for others, fighting for freedom. We feel that. But it's a trick of our genes, so to speak, to get us to behave in a certain way, but we don't actually have an objective purpose that we are supposed to do. You say if we don't do it, then somebody dies out. Yeah, that's a fact. We're still at the is. But that feeling that has...
Well, again, this is the point, right? So purpose is a little different from morality. I mean, you might think they're the same, but at least plausibly they could come apart. So we may have purposes that are not necessarily moral in nature. I mean, a simple example would be artifact, right? So the purpose of a mug is to, hold liquid, typically hot liquids, but doesn't have to be, and to be drunk from. That's not really there's nothing moral about that. It's just its purpose, its function, right? And so this I prefer to talk about function rather than purpose. I think they're pretty much the same thing. And I think I've been thinking quite a lot about this lately, about this functional language and when we can appeal to that, because functional language is everywhere in biology. And in cognitive science as well, which is my field, we constantly appeal to function. And often there's a sort of a justification in terms of evolution, but not all functions are evolutionarily derived. Many are socially derived. Like you could ask, what's the function of money? Clearly, money has a function. It has a function in society, but that doesn't, I mean, there's a process of sort of cultural evolution there, but it's certainly not biological evolution that gave us that. Actually, the same is true with language. which is what I study, right? So humans evolved to be able to have language, but languages themselves have not evolved. It's tricky here. Biological evolution has not shaped the diversity of human languages and like which words come and go and grammar and things like that. There hasn't been enough time. Language evolves much faster than biological evolution. So the point is, in my view, there are many forms of function that are not derivable from evolution. I mean, I just gave an example, right? There's nothing evolutionary about the function of a mug, right? Some of them relate to human design decisions, but others don't, like language, natural languages, and also money. Those things weren't designed. They sort of emerged over time, or you could say the economy more broadly, right? Governments. Aspects of those are designed, but the institutions themselves evolved over time as a result of the sort of emergent interactions of many decisions of humans, blah, blah, blah. So it's sort of interesting to think about how social systems emerge and how they gain their functions when they're not evolved or stipulated by like individual humans most of the time. But the point I'm making is that this notion of function is a very interesting one, and I think something that is widely appealed to in many forms of science, and is worthy to take pretty seriously and talk about what is a function and when does something have a function and how do you know that it has that function. I actually think that we can give functions to entirely non-biological systems as well. I gave an example when I was talking to Nathan recently. I can't remember what the topic was, but I gave the example of like the global circulation cells in the atmosphere on Earth, or like the North Atlantic current, right? You may hear an Earth scientist say something like, well, these have the function of dispersing temperature, dispersing heat over the surface of the Earth, right? That's what they do in the sort of Earth system, right? So I think that if you sort of define a system and define its key causal components and how they interact, then you can define function in terms of the set of causal processes the set of causes or mechanisms that achieve a certain outcome or deliver a certain result, right? Yeah, you can understand that in functional terms. And then, so once we understand function in physical terms, then we can potentially understand purpose in physical terms. Now, I don't think the Earth's atmosphere has purpose in this sort of sense that we would think of it, but I think humans potentially can. But you know, there's obviously more work that we're going to need to do there to talk about sort of, well, what's the purpose of life, right? Well, we can maybe relate that to function. So one function of human beings is certainly in a biological sense is to sort of stay healthy and to reproduce. So we can ask, well, does that mean that that's our purpose in life? Well, not necessarily, but maybe it's informed by that in some way. So I'm not advocating for a very particular view about what the purpose of life is or anything, or that it comes from evolution. All I'm trying to say is that this notion of function, which is connected to purpose, maybe the same as purpose, is certainly understandable in my view in natural terms, because many, many things have functions that are not evolved or are not, you know, God-given or whatever. And that analysis of function, we can potentially understand the purpose of things, right, by looking at their functions, and maybe even human beings if we do enough work to put the pieces together. Right now, it seems like Sean McDowell thinks that purpose has to be given externally, that you can't determine the purpose of something just by looking at how it functions, which interestingly is not even what all Christians think, because like the Aristotelian view is that you can determine the function of something by looking at its nature, and that includes human beings. So he thought the essential nature of human beings is to be rational, and then you can understand their purpose in terms of kind of exercising that function. And there's actually a lot of interesting philosophy about this sort of neo-Aristotelian views about looking at the properties of something and the functions that those properties fulfill, and therefore looking at understanding the purpose of that thing. And I have some sympathies towards that, right? Though I certainly don't agree with everything that Aristotle said. But the point is that you can absolutely understand purpose and function in natural terms just by looking at the properties of something and how it is, how it operates, what it does, and then potentially, again, with additional work, build on that to develop an idea of purpose. So even many theists think this, although they'll think that God is at the base of it all, of course. Sean seems to think that no, purpose only comes externally, which is interesting because, of course, you can ask the question, well, where does God's purpose come from? There's nothing external to himself. So presumably he thinks that there's some kind of intrinsic purpose, at least to something in the universe, and everything else, I guess, comes from God, directly or indirectly, like maybe purpose comes from humans in some cases, but humans get that from God. I don't know what he'd say exactly. But the point it all comes down to is that Sean needs to articulate what that theory is and argue for it, not just assume it. Obviously, if you're an atheist and you think that there's such thing as purpose, you're not going to ground that in God, you're going to ground it in something else. So Sean can't just say, well, atheists don't have anything external to humanity to appeal to, or don't have any external agent specifically to appeal to get our purpose from, and so we can't have a purpose. Well, that's just question begging, because it assumes that humans need to get a purpose from some external agent, which not only I reject, and I think all atheists should reject, but many theists reject as well. So again, there's this issue of just kind of assuming the Christian apologists, assuming that their position is doesn't need defense, and then critiquing the atheists to then give a grounding of like purpose and morality and things like that. When in fact the same issues that they're going to raise, fair questions that they're going to ask of the atheists, the same also apply to the apologist or to the Christian. But they just sort of somehow don't realize this. So if Sean articulates or implies a particular idea of purpose and where it comes from, he needs to defend that. He can't just assume it and then critique Shermer's view on the basis that Shermer hasn't defended it, when he himself hasn't defended his view.
Has bubbled up through evolution that operates in a way towards getting us to survive, doesn't carry any obligation or authority within itself. If I don't want to listen to my genes, if I don't want to follow some of the principles that we're given, that would be one of my challenges. And I would also say, this is something C.S. Lewis brought up in The Abolition of Man, because in your quote, he said, why is it better, again, fighting towards poverty and real progress? Why is that better? You said, because it's in our nature to prefer flourishing to suffering. But as you point out in your book, that's not the only thing that's within our nature. Within our nature sometimes is to harm people, to steal, to hurt people, to lie. You and I agree 100% that we have our better angel and our worser angel. Actually, that's not a word, but you get the point.
Inner demons.
Exactly. What better said. Good point. And so if both of these bubble up from within our nature and make us feel a certain way, there's got to be something outside of our nature that we say, oh, that one is objectively good, and that instinct is objectively bad. That can't come from within nature. And if there's no morality outside of our feelings, outside of evolution, then there's no basis by which we can say one is objectively purposeful, objectively right, since they're both instincts. Now, I'd love to come back to the idea of
Again, I think Sean hasn't thought through this very carefully. So let's take the idea isn't that, well, again, Shermer might say, but if someone's going to appeal to human nature to ground morality, someone like Aristotle, right? Not saying he would argue exactly what I'm saying, but like this idea that you can ground purpose and morality from human nature. The idea isn't that you look at how humans sort of naturally behave or our instincts, and then you derive morality from that, right? Because obviously humans have good and bad instincts. That's not going to get you anywhere. No, the claim is something like, look at humans as organisms and as rational agents as well, but you can sort of think about it in either level and think about how they function. So one example is, we need to eat, right? We need to eat to survive, and there's certain nutritional requirements. So that's one function. We need to regulate our body temperatures. We need social interactions as well. Humans don't do well for long-term in isolations, well in terms of like functioning psychologically, right? So if we understand these sorts of functions, these biological, cognitive, and social functions, we can also what's the function of the mind? It's to sort of form certain representations and promote behaviors and so on. And then there's sort of functional and dysfunctional ways the mind can go, and you look at mental illness and then irrational beliefs and all that sort of stuff. So we understand these sort of biological, social, cognitive functions, and then we ask, in what circumstances are those functions being effectively fulfilled or exercised, or is it functioning well is another way to put it. And well here doesn't mean morally well, just like, well, what makes a good mug doesn't mean what is morally good about a mug. It just means what are the characteristics of mugs that perform function well. So a good digestive system, right? A good respiratory system, a good environment to survive in from the elements, a good mindset to operate in life, a good set of social interactions with other people, right? So again, good meaning here, fulfilling that function well, right? And then the idea would be, well, we're going to argue that morality refers to the or something is morally good if it is a set of circumstances that promotes these sets of functionings, right? So a circumstance is morally good if it promotes human functioning to a greater degree, right? So that's the fundamental idea. And that's more or less actually what I argue about morality, although I argue it from a bit of a different direction. But the point is that you establish a set of functionings that are not moral in themselves, but relate to like human, again, biological, social, cognitive functionings. And then you make a substantive moral claim to connect these functionings to what we mean by like what moral discourse relates to. So human well-being then is relates to fulfillment of these functions, and human well-being is what is referred to, or what moral discourse is about. And of course, you have to do your analysis to argue that is what moral discourse is about. It's not about something else, right? So there's further arguments to be made there. You still need to do your meta-ethics. But again, the point I'm simply making is that I don't think Sean understands what the argument is supposed to be. The argument isn't that you just look at human instincts and say whatever humans have an instinct to do is human nature, and that grounds morality. Human nature here means, it is, again, at least in the Aristotelian tradition and in other ways of thinking about this that I'm familiar with, human nature refers essentially to facts about the way humans are and what circumstances lead them to function well or poorly. So human nature here would refer to something like the types of things we need to eat in order to not get sick and die, right? Or the types of interactions we need to have with other people in order to not go crazy or become depressed, right? Or the types of physical environment we need to live in order to not get too cold or too hot. Or even the types of the type of mindset that we need to develop in order to go about our lives most effectively, right? All of these different levels of functioning that derive ultimately from the way human beings are. That's what is meant by human nature, facts about humans. And again, you can appeal to this whether you're a theist or not. It's intrinsic facts about the way humans are, which you would then build on and argue that, in fact, morality is getting at these sets of facts here. And yes, that's a substantive moral claim. So you can't just say these things contribute to human functioning, therefore we should do them. You do need to add your substantive moral claim that morality relates to this set of human functionings. And again, I think that there are arguments that render that plausible, much more plausible than anything that divine command theorists have to say. But the point is, Sean doesn't even seem to understand what is meant by human nature here. Human nature doesn't mean things that we sort of innately desire or don't desire to do. Because again, some of those are good and some of those are bad. The idea is what things are conducive to facilitating the functions of being a human, right from biological up to sort of social and cognitive. And circumstances that promote these are those that are conducive to the fulfillment of human nature, or the human flourishing is another way to put it. And that's what's meant by appealing to human nature here. And Sean just seems to have completely not understood that point. But I mean, it's sort of fair enough, because not like Shermer's articulated the point. So I'm done, again, doing the work for him. And I want to add, this isn't the only way you can argue for moral realism, by the way. It's not exactly the way I argue for it either. But I do think there's at least a logic to this here that we can discuss, right? It's not just mere stipulation and assertion. But unfortunately, that's kind of all we've got in the discussion so far. Shermer said, oh, morality, you just sort of assume that it's about human well-being. We're not really going to theorize that or say much about it. And then McDowell has sort of obliquely said, well, you just get that naturally from God, and not explain that. I'm hoping that we can have a bit more of that in the discussion, but so far we haven't really had much of substance actually from either of them.
Cooperative, reciprocal cooperative. Let's hold that one off and come back to it. But I think that would be my challenge as it comes to grounding it in our nature, the process of evolution. And we're not debating whether evolution is true or not. That's not the point. We're just saying that's within your system, naturalistic evolution. You've appealed to it as a means of explaining evolution. So in principle, evolution can give us feelings. It can give us instincts. It can make us think that we have purposes. But those aren't grounded in anything besides the unguided material process of evolution. So I'm not bound to follow those, given that I have other instincts as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, so
I don't know what it means for us to be bound to follow something. Right? Because unless you're a pretty hardcore Calvinist, we're not bound to follow anything that God says either. So maybe he means like, well, you have a normative obligation to do it, but you could still choose not to. But of course, then Shermer could say, well, you have a normative obligation to do things that contribute to human well-being, even if you could choose not to. And then we're at the point where, well, we just have to argue for which theory is more plausible, right? It's not like one of them binds you in some way that the other doesn't. It's just the different theories about the nature of normativity. So again, I'm not sure. McDowell seems to think he's on safer ground here, but he hasn't really said anything about why. It seems, again, the same criticisms that he's levying against Shermer could just be levied straight back in the opposite direction. Now, someone notes here, oh, Noble Aristotelian, interesting name for the subject. But what if someone argues that the claims of divine command theory have an is-ought claim built into them? I've heard this before, but not sure it's plausible. What do you think? I think I've heard claims like that before. I'm not entirely sure what the specifics would be. I mean, you can phrase something in a way that includes moral language, like as a premise. So, like you could say something like, well, actually, the claim is typically something like that God's nature is inherently good. I think effectively that is going to be the core claim that links the is and the ought, because the idea would be, well, if someone who is inherently and perfectly good says that you should do something, then presumably like they're not going to be wrong about that, right? Because they kind of obviously know what the right thing would be, and then would only tell you to do that because they're perfectly and inherently good. But the point there is that is, I think you still have to make the argument that morality, that human morality is, yeah, you still have to make the argument that that human moral discourse is connected to that being, because there could be a being out there whom we say, oh, they're perfectly morally good, but what does that have to do with human normative obligations? It's sort of, even if you say they're perfectly good, I still think there's further theories that need to be given as to the relationship between human action and that alleged perfectly good entity. I mean, one example would be that this is a classic issue with divine command theory, which is how you ground the notion of goodness, and so therefore what it means to say that God is perfectly good. I mean, I'm probably jumping the gun a bit here, but if goodness is whatever's God's if goodness is just whatever God's nature is, then it seems to be circular and sort of non-informative to say that God is good. Because what is goodness? Well, it's what God's nature is. So God's nature is consistent with itself. That's kind of a entirely non-informative grounding of morality, and I don't think really works. I could say more about that, but the point is, you can, and this is what people who advocate for divine command theory do effectively. They try to build in the necessary normative claims in order to get the theory to work, and essentially, I don't find the responses very convincing. It's also interesting. Yes, this is actually a good point. Ideal observer ethics, which I write about this in my book. Ideal observer theory, I think, is a really good counter to divine command theories, because ideal observer theory is pretty much exactly the same as divine command theory, except it doesn't require that the command actually exists. It's just, well, if there was a divine commander, what would they tell us to do? And the thing is that many theists seem to think that there is a fact of the matter about this. Like, if there was a perfectly good being, there'd be a fact of the matter about what they would say we should do. And in other words, the perfect being wouldn't just be free to tell us to do anything. There'd be some sort of constraints, fact of the matter about, well, they could only say to do this because anything else would be sort of in some way inconsistent. And the thing is, if that is true, right, if it's true that there is a fact of the matter about what a perfectly good being would say to do, then you can just ground morality in that. Right? You don't actually need the being to exist. This is what I think divine command theorists don't understand very well, at least many of them don't, is that the whole initial point of theological voluntarism, like divine command theory, is that God could command to do anything, right? He could tell us to do horrible things, or things that we would regard as horrible, or things that we would regard as good, right? And God has the freedom to do that. And therefore, it's the fact that God is commanding it, that fact, that free choice that God makes, grounds the moral obligations that we have. Because without God making that injunction, like without God choosing to say, hey, do this, then there's actually no fact of the matter about what we should do, right? But suppose you think, no, God can't just choose us to command anything. No. There's a fact of the matter. There's one way that it would be that a perfectly loving or perfectly good being would tell us to do. He would always say, do this, right? But if you think that, then there seems to be some kind of constraint or fact of the matter prior to or separate from that perfectly good being. In which case you can just say, well, that whatever that is is what grounds morality. Or in other words, you can say, look, what grounds morality is whatever a perfectly good being would command us to do. You don't need the perfectly good being to actually exist, because they don't have any actual freedom, right? There's only one thing that they would ever command, and just say, well, whatever that is, that's what we should do. So I think that may be a subtle point, right? But if you think that God is free to command us to do anything, then if that's the version of divine command theory that you're defending, then I think that you are subject to the objection that morality is entirely arbitrary and is dependent on whatever God just happened to command, right? Which is not really a very good grounding for morality. Many theists recognize that, and they say, no. God only commands the things consistent with his perfectly good nature. In which case they seem to be saying God doesn't have any choice of the matter. In which case you can just say, okay, well, I'll grant morality in whatever it is that a perfectly good being would command. You don't actually need the being to exist then. The only reason you'd need them to exist is if they had a choice and you needed to get their choice to be to act as the grounding, right? But if they didn't have any choice and there's a fact of the matter anyway, then just appeal to that directly. So this is one of the reasons why I think God is just totally irrelevant to grounding ethics, because either God makes ethics arbitrary or he's just unnecessary, and you can just appeal to what he would command, whether or not he exists. And this is the divine. This is the ideal observer objection. And actually, I've never heard an apologist respond to this, because they don't seem to know about ideal observer theory. I don't know. It's interesting because the apologist can't say that there's no fact of the matter about what an ideal observer would command, because they believe that the ideal observer actually exists, right? So the only thing that they could do is say, well, there's no fact of the matter about what they would do because God has freedom to do anything that he wants, right? In which case you can't appeal to a hypothetical ideal observer because you don't know what they would command, right? Or there's no fact of the matter about what they would command. They could command anything, so we need an actual ideal observer to do the commanding. But in that case, they've just admitted that morality is arbitrary because God could command us to do anything. So it's arbitrary based on his whim. And then they want to say, no, it's not arbitrary. It's determined by his nature. Well, then God doesn't have freedom, and you can go the ideal observer objection. So I really don't think that divine command theory works, even if there's attempts to alter the way in which you can. The point is, you can get around the is-ought objection as a divine command theorist. I just think that attempts to do that basically render God completely superfluous. Yes, and this is a different way to put this is God seems to have a boss or rules above him. This is effectively the point. Either God can do anything, and in which case morality is ultimately arbitrary. God could have commanded whatever. Or if that's not the case, it seems like there's some rules that God is following. In which case, just appeal to those rules, or facts, if you prefer. Just appeal to those. Forget about God. Like maybe God tells us what the rules are, but he's not actually the ground, the ultimate basis of why those things are right or wrong. And what some theists will just sort of say is, well, yeah, those things exist, but they're like part of God. And then maybe they appeal to divine simplicity or something like that. And well, anyway, that I think that raises a whole host of other issues. Anyway, let's just try to make a bit more progress in this video before I have to get to bed.
Yeah, you're not bound to it, but societies flourish best when most of the people, most of the time, are cooperative with one another. Now, within any given community, let's say hunter-gatherers of a few dozen to a few hundred people, you will find a handful of free riders, bullies, cheaters, and so on. That does happen. And in fact,
I'm so uninterested in what Shermer is saying because he's not really addressing the points here. So I'm really just wanting to go back to McDowell, unless Shermer actually starts critiquing like McDowell's views, which I would be interested in. He sort of alluded to that before, but if he's just going to talk about evolution free riders, I don't think that actually addresses the issue.
In nature. Something on the order of 90% of homicides are moralistic. They're not instrumental. The guy killed somebody and it's the word is when the power
there's chaos. So I agree that that's helpful. But here's where I disagree. You said, and I'm going to make sure I got this right. You said societies flourish better when we are moral. I totally agree with you on that. Societies break down and there's chaos. We can't do a business deal if we don't trust each other. We're not going to put our money in the bank if we don't trust each other. Societies flourish best when we are moral. Agreed. You gave the example of kind of cooperation with people. This was last time. And that you can't just pretend to be a good person. You've got to really be a good person, example you gave. And then you said it pays to do that. And that's why I think we differ. Because while we agree that being moral and following the kind of moral principles that you lay out helps society flourish better, the way you've laid this out, as I understand it, is morality now is instrumental. It's towards accomplishing some end, which is maybe flourishing or getting the kinds of things or pleasures in life that I want. So society has eliminated most people that are evil so we can flourish together. Okay, that's happened. This is a description of what's taken place in a society and an observation. We're at the is part that societies flourish better when we play what's called the moral game. So you gave an example of truth telling, right? Like if I want to be in a relationship with you, and you write about this in your book, like you can't have any kind of decent relationship if you don't tell the truth. And people can tell if you're faking it, and they can tell if you're not sincere. It's like we have a BS meter just built into us. But it seems to me when it comes to telling truth, that's secondary. The moral project is that truth telling has an intrinsic goodness within itself, even if a relationship is harmed by it in some fashion.
Okay, but so what McDowell just said there is a substantive claim in normative ethics that truth telling is intrinsically good. I suspect someone like Shermer is probably going to disagree with that. My views on that are a little complicated because I think I think that morally speaking, the only thing that is intrinsically morally good is well-being. So truth telling, I don't think is intrinsically morally good. I do think truth telling is, well, in general, is epistemically good. So, but what we're doing there is we're asking different questions. Epistemic normativity relates to norms norms regarding acquisition of knowledge and or like understanding and things like that. So we could say that it's epistemically, well, let's use the language of virtue. You could say it's epistemically virtuous to always tell the truth, but it may not be morally virtuous to always do that, because maybe you'd cause more harm than good in certain situations. In fact, I think that that's very rare, and you should basically always tell the truth. But the point is, I wouldn't say that truth-telling is intrinsically morally good. I think there are there's different types of there are different types of norms, I think is the best way to put it. And so epistemic norms and moral norms don't necessarily always coincide. But I think when you're talking about like value, moral goodness, then that relates to facts about human well-being. That's just my personal view. Other people will have different views. Irrespective of that, McDowell, I don't think can just state that it's just an accepted moral fact that truth-telling is intrinsically good, because well, clearly not everyone's going to agree with that. Like most consequentialists won't agree that truth-telling is intrinsically morally good. I suppose theoretically you could if you grounded your consequentialism in a certain way, but in general, they're going to say whether or not truth-telling is good is going to depend on the consequences of that action. And that's really a claim in normative ethics. It doesn't really have anything to do with meta-ethics. So I'm not really sure why it's being brought up here.
We should tell the truth, period. Now, I'm not saying there's not some exceptions, hiding a Jew from the Nazis. That's not my point. We can come up with some exceptions, but for the vast majority of cases, telling the truth has intrinsic good, not just instrumental good. So here's the way I look at it, and you can tell me if you think I'm wrong. If I said to you, okay, we want to flourish as a basketball team, so we need height. You need to share the ball. You need to close the gaps on defense, whatever it is. And you look and you go, well, I don't want to play basketball. I'd rather play football. You're not bound to play basketball if you don't choose to play that game. There's no higher rule that says if you want this team to flourish, don't play. I don't see that as being any different from human beings in a naturalistic universe. You've laid out that we do flourish better if you scratch my back and I scratch yours. I go, I agree with that. We flourish better. But that's still on the is level. There is no moral ought that says I am bound and I have duty and obligation to do this from within a naturalistic system.
So actually, one response to this that I think is quite interesting is essentially to argue that morality is about social functioning. So this is sort of what Shermer is saying, except he's doing it in a lazy way. But the argument is, yeah, morality just is about social functioning. Just as much as you could say, well, look, there's certain criteria that makes a basketball team function well or poorly in the context of winning basketball games and playing in a league. Likewise, there are certain properties that make societies function better or worse in the domain of like being a society, facilitating humans interacting with each other, right? And you can point to many of the things Shermer's already said about the things that make societies work better. And so the substantive moral claim is then essentially that's just what morality is. It's just about effective social functioning. And the idea here would then be to in response to what McDowell said, is that if you are a human being living in a society, you can't just kind of opt out of that, right? Because you are living in the society. So like you can opt out of playing basketball. You can just walk off the side like, no, I'm out. I'm not going to play anymore. You can't really do that if you live in a society. That's hence we live in a society, right? Now you could argue, well, what if you become a hermit and you go somewhere without any people, far away from everyone, don't interact with anyone ever again? You know, we can argue about edge cases like that, but the fact of the matter is almost no one actually does that. And it's in fact very difficult to do that because there's societies kind of wherever you go, right? So this, I think, is kind of an interesting idea that the moral domain is such that it's practically impossible, at least in pretty much any ordinary circumstance, to opt out of it. And that is in fact what gives the normative force, is because you're in the social game and you can't exit it in the same way that you can just stop playing a basketball game, right? So this is one way to try to make sense of normativity, is that it's not that you agree to it necessarily or you like it, it's just that you are living in a society and therefore your actions have effects on other people, and therefore the moral logic of relating to what contributes to social functioning is applicable to and relevant to your actions, and that is effectively what normativity is on this view. It's a theory of normativity. That's a substantive theory, right? It's not true by definition, right? It's just saying that, look, this is one way to theorize, to understand where normativity comes from. It comes from the fact that we live in a society and social functioning is what sort of morality is ultimately about, and therefore moral obligations arise from the fact that you are in a society, your actions will have effects on other people, and therefore you have an obligation to act in accordance with that because you're there and you sort of can't leave in a way that you can just stop doing other sorts of activities. So I think that kind of reasoning is quite interesting. And I don't remember the names, but there's some philosophers who've written about this that I'm been reading from my book, actually, as one way to understand the nature of normativity. But again, this is a substantive theory of normativity. You can't just assume it. Like you give your arguments for it, just like any substantive theory. And what I would do is challenge McDowell. Well, what's his theory of normativity, right? Why does presumably he's going to say it comes from God? Well, like why? What's the theory there? Again, it needs to be consistent. If you're going to challenge the atheists to define and defend a theory of where moral obligations come from, then the theist needs to do the same thing. They can't just assume that they get it for free, because all of the same objections can be levied just as much to them. And in general, I think their theories are far worse.
That's what I don't think naturalism can explain. Now, at this point, we might be going round and round. I want to let you give your response to this and then move on to other things. But I think, to me, that's the big difference of how we're approaching this. But go ahead.
I guess it depends what we mean by naturalistic. I mean, I'm including just human society and relationships as part of the natural world. It's something you can observe. Again, you can observe people move with their feet where they'd rather live. Well, it is uplifting. Just not to me, if
obligations,
if that's the case.
Okay, so this is a healthy transition, or helpful transition, in the sense that you said these objective values are not random, relative, or arbitrary. I agree with that. The question is, are they binding? And do we actually have moral obligations to obey them? So it seems to me that you're pointing towards people having feelings of coming to America, desires to come to America, understandable, desires for health, desires for other things in life. I agree with you. Those desires exist. It's objective in that sense. But what I have not heard, and maybe we just need to let this go and move on, is why these are binding within themselves and why they're obligations, not just feelings that have bubbled up through evolution. Now, you said if God exists, correct me if I don't say this correctly, you said if God exists, we should still be able to follow these reasons together because they're out there for us. Now, I would say, of course, you don't believe that, obviously, and I know that you don't believe that. But I think the question is not, do we have common ground? We started with this, that you and I agree we can know right and wrong in common ways. So as a Christian, I look out and I go, oh, people have feelings of wanting to flourish, wanting to come to America. Those feelings are real. But those are not just feelings. I have moral obligations to love and care for my neighbor because of who God is and the commandments God has given us. So I think the difference is, I assume you see it differently, is in your system, you have to start with an if, which is not a part of the system. It's not axiomatic within naturalism. In my system, if there is a God, and this God is good, and he's given us commandments to love one another, then it's built in we should care for the survival and flourishing of others. So I say, yes, we have common ground to share about.
Okay, so this is a very bad objection, right? Because obviously under just naturalism, it's not clear that Shermer is, well, okay, naturalism and materialism are a little different. It's not clear that he's a materialist, at least. I guess he's a naturalist, based on what he said, although some other comments would indicate otherwise. But anyway, the point is, just plain old naturalism or plain old atheism doesn't come with a theory of morality. That's true, right? You need to add that on. And Christianity does come with a theory of morality. So in that sense, McDowell is correct when he says, well, his theory comes with, his worldview, Christianity, comes with a built-in theory of morality, the built-in if, he said, which is where the morality comes from. It comes from God's commandments and whatever. Whereas Shermer's doesn't, because naturalism doesn't come with any theory of normativity or morality. You have to add that on, right? It's an add-on. It's an extra. But the reason it's a terrible objection is because that only has force in virtue of the way that McDowell has defined Shermer's worldview. He's just defined it as naturalism or atheism or materialism. In order to get around this, all Shermer has to do is say, oh, well, I'm not just a naturalist, I'm a naturalist plus, and then add on whatever he wants, right? And this is what he would do anyway. Like maybe he'd say, yeah, but I'm a secular humanist as well. And that comes with it a built-in theory about normativity and morality and evolution and human flourishing and whatever, blah, 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 like all the stuff he's been saying. Essentially, all Shermer has to do is define his worldview to include a bunch of views which already are part of it, so I'm not sure why he would exclude them, and then say, well, yeah, it comes in built in my view that we have these moral obligations and moral facts. Yeah, it's just part of my worldview, right? Just as McDowell is saying, yeah, it's already part of my worldview. So notice that McDowell didn't actually defend his worldview. He simply said that because the meta-ethical and moral claims were already part of it, that somehow that means that they don't need to be subject to criticism. I don't know exactly. I think that's sort of what he was implying, that because they're already part of his worldview, then they're okay. He just sort of gets them. But then Shermer can just define whatever he wants to be part of his worldview too, and then he doesn't have to defend them. The if claims are built in, right? This is why it's a terrible objection, because it doesn't actually address any of the arguments for or against either worldview. It simply says that by virtue of the claims being part of the worldview, that therefore they don't have to be discussed or defended, which is ridiculous. I don't think he would say that, but that appears to be what he said. And again, I mean, he said, well, my normative theory is already part of Christianity, so he gets it for free. But Shermer, your views aren't already part of naturalism, so therefore you have to defend them. But all Shermer has to do is say, well, no, I'm a secular humanist. I'm not just a naturalist, and so my worldview includes all of these things, includes the sort of if statements, right? It's built. I've built them in. And so now what? We're just in an impasse where each of us has a different worldview that says different things. And because McDowell hasn't actually given us any tools or shown us how to critically evaluate, to compare and contrast the explanatory adequacy of those views, there's really nothing more to say. So I think this is why this is such a terrible objection, because the objection doesn't actually address reasons for or against any position. It simply is based on what you define the package of views, like the worldview, to be. And he's just sort of defining his own to include claims that he doesn't therefore have to defend, but he's defining Shermer's in a way that excludes the claims that he wants to be able to attack, right? Which is just entirely arbitrary. Okay, so Shermer can just define his worldview to include those things, and then where are we? I can't. It's really bizarre that McDowell actually argued in that way. What he should say is that his worldview is better because it has better arguments and reasons for it. Which presumably he would say that, right? But sort of the question is then, well, why didn't he say that? Why didn't he actually try to defend his version of divine command theory, or however he sees the defense of his meta-ethical views, instead of just saying, well, it's already part of what I believe, so therefore I don't have to defend it. But you, Shermer, do have to defend it because it isn't somehow part of your worldview, even though obviously it is, because Shermer's just been talking about it for the last 40 minutes. What a really strange thing to say.
Flourishing and survival, though, I would flesh out what we mean by flourishing a little bit differently, which doesn't matter. But these feelings that we have are not just feelings. They're actually built into reality, which seems to me to give a theistic view the upper hand because it doesn't have to assume that. That's how I see it. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, I think.
What does he mean it doesn't have to assume that? That's part of the worldview. It's assumed by the worldview. Now, you could argue, well, we don't assume it because we have arguments for it, but McDowell isn't giving arguments for it. His version of we don't have to assume it is just a way of saying it's part of my worldview. But Shermer's just telling you his worldview, and these things are part of his worldview. Now, maybe they don't make sense. Maybe his reasons aren't good. But again, McDowell hasn't given any reasons or justifications. The only thing he said is it's already part of my worldview. So the only thing that Shermer has to say in response is, well, it's part of my worldview too. Look, I'm not just a naturalist. I'm a secular humanist too. And then I grab all of these moral beliefs and justifications and whatever, and that's part of my worldview. So now it's already part of it. And so now we're each standing there with our own worldviews, and all the views that we want is like packaged deals. And we're in an impasse, according to McDowell, right? Because he hasn't actually said anything about how we evaluate those different views.
I guess I would respond to that. That again, if the way something is leads to survival and flourishing of sentient beings, then we ought to do that. That's
Why?
It's an obligation. You made a promise.
Well, come on, McDowell. So all Shermer has to say at this point is, well, that's part of my worldview. Because that's all you, McDowell, have said. You just said it's part of your worldview. So all Shermer has to do is say, yeah, but that's part of my worldview. Now, I don't think that's a satisfactory answer, but I'm saying this was the point at the start. You have to be fair. You have to have the same standards in both cases. So if it's fine for McDowell just to say, well, it's part of my worldview, that God's commands give us moral obligations and whatever all the other things, then Shermer can just say, well, it's part of his worldview as a secular humanist, that morality is just about human flourishing, right? There's no difference at this point. At that point, they've just asserted what each of them thinks about the nature of morality. Neither has actually defended it. And so the issue here is that McDowell is requiring Shermer to defend his view, which is reasonable, but he is at the same time denying that he needs to defend anything, because he just sort of says, oh, it's already part of my worldview. And he just seems incapable of seeing that that's exactly what Shermer is saying. Maybe Shermer hasn't said it in that many words, but that is what he's saying. Shermer is just, when McDowell challenges Shermer to defend his view about murder ethics, Shermer he's not really capable of doing that, so he just reiterates his view, right? And so McDowell thinks, Shermer is incapable of defending his worldview. But the problem is that he's inconsistent there, because he, at the same time, says, I don't have to defend my meta-ethics because it's already part of my worldview, without understanding that Shermer's meta-ethics are part of his worldview. And so by McDowell's own logic, Shermer shouldn't have to defend them. And McDowell is not unique in this, because Craig and other apologists they do the exact same thing. They somehow think they don't have to defend their own meta-ethical views, whilst requiring atheists to provide a rigorous defense of theirs. And I really, really, really dislike this, because one of the things that I dislike most is inconsistent standards and being unfair to a position. And I can't see anything else but that being done here. Shermer is not doing a good job, but it's McDowell who is the one who seems to be pretty clearly requiring something of Shermer that he himself that he declares that he doesn't need to give, which is a defense of his position.
Promise, you ought to keep your promise.
Why?
Well, why? The hell with it. Well, then fine. Then you're a sinner. You would say that person's a sinner. I mean, you'd recognize as a Christian that people are born sinful. What do we mean by that? Well, they're not doing what they ought to do. They're not following their obligations. They're not keeping their promises. They're breaking their trust. They're lying, whatever it is. And I think we're in agreement on that. It's just, what do you mean by these words? And of course, even Christians sin. Well, why?
Agreed.
You were obligated. Well, yeah, I know, but I screwed up. Okay. So, my person says, yeah, I know I should have been more cooperative, nice, and tipped or whatever, but I didn't feel like it. Yeah, well, then you're a jerk. Whatever. I don't see how you can get any more objective, or whatever the word is, absolute, or essentially you're looking for an outside source that says these are the things we ought to do.
Okay, I think Shermer's grasping at some good points here. I think he's articulating them in a bit of a muddled way, but yeah, I mean, the point about that Christians that apologists like to say is that, well, what if I don't want to contribute to human flourishing? Which is a silly objection, because, of course, you could just as much say, well, what if I don't want to do what God says, right? That's not actually an objection to anything. You can't object to someone having a moral obligation by arguing that it is possible for them not to fulfill that moral obligation. That just misunderstands what a moral obligation is, right? The whole point is that you can, in some sense at least, choose whether to do it or not. Putting aside like the nature of free will, I don't think that's critical here. And so that just isn't an objection. And so Shermer then has just said, it looks like McDowell is thinking that say obligations need to come externally from some external source. I think McDowell actually has said that, or something to that effect. So it'd be interesting to see how he responds here. But again, what Shermer should say is that that's just an assumption. Like, why is it that moral obligations have to come from something external to humanity? Like, what's the justification from that? Because as a naturalist, I don't think that moral obligations have to come from something external to humanity. I think we can derive them from the nature from human nature, like the way humans are. And you talk about functioning and all this sort of stuff, right? And of course, McDowell's going to say, yeah, but why think that we have moral obligations in virtue of that? And you say, well, I think that's what moral obligations are, right? This is my theory of moral obligations, and here are my reasons for supporting it. What's your theory of moral obligations, and what reasons do you give for supporting those? And then you actually have the metaethics discussion. You don't just keep getting in a position of, I don't need to defend mine, but please keep defending yours. But anyway, Shermer's getting at some good points here, so let's hear where it goes. Hopefully we keep on this point and we don't get sidetracked.
Because God said so. But my point is, and here's how I put it here, is let's see, is what is morally right or wrong commanded by God because it's inherently right or wrong, or is it morally right or wrong only because it's commanded by God? If murder is wrong because God said it is wrong, what if he said it was right? Would that make murder acceptable? Of course not. If God commanded murder wrong for good reasons, what are the reasons?
Okay, this is very good. It's a bit disappointing that it took us 45 minutes to get to the Euthyphro dilemma, but let's see what Sean has to say.
And why can't we base our prescription against murder on those reasons alone and skip the divine command stage altogether? Anyway.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought this up. We can come back to the Euthyphro dilemma. But what I would say is to the simple question.
Why would we come back to it? Can't we just talk about that now?
Why keep promises? I think it's easy because we live in a moral universe and promise keeping is objectively good. God is truth and we shouldn't tell lies, and we know this. So I think when we reason about truth.
But McDowell, Shermer can just say the same thing and probably would say the same thing, right? He could just say, look, why keep your promises? Because we live in a moral universe and telling the truth is objectively good, right? He will just agree with that. And then, of course, McDowell's going to say, yeah, but why does Shermer think that telling the truth is morally good? And Shermer can say something about human flourishing, right? And then McDowell can ask, but why is human flourishing good? And I think Shermer should then say, well, look, because that's my meta-ethical theory about what morality is and what normativity is. And then here's the reasons for why we should favor that theory. And you do your conceptual analysis, right? You go through and you give the arguments. The exact same things should happen in reverse when McDowell says, well, you should, the reason why keeping your promises, telling the truth is good is because God tells us to value truth or something. And then Shermer asks, well, why does the fact that God says it mean that we ought to do it? And then McDowell is going to say something about God's nature, that God is by nature perfectly good. And so whatever he says will correctly or accurately replicate or reflect moral facts. And then Shermer can point to the Euthyphro dilemma and we can keep talking about that. So again, same thing in both directions. This is the point I want to make. It's the same in both cases. You both will agree that there is a moral fact of the matter that makes truth-telling good, right? And they will then just disagree about the nature of what makes that moral fact good, because they have different meta-ethical theories, and each equally needs to defend that meta-ethical theory. It's not somehow different in Shermer's case to McDowell's case. Yes, and pretty much Shermer just said the exact same things that McDowell did, but he swapped human evolution with God. Now, you can certainly argue as to whether human evolution and well-being and all that is a better or worse explanation than God. But really all I'm saying is that that should be the discussion, right? It should be comparing the merits of those theories and not pretending that that Shermer needs to do something, whereas McDowell doesn't. That's the real problem here. And Shermer he's sort of noticed this, but he just doesn't seem to be interested in really pressing it. But maybe they'll get to it when they talk about Euthyphro.
Truth-telling, I think two things are operating. On one level, what you say, we're operating like, well, I want to be a good business person, and I don't want to lose relationships like that. Human horizontal level operates, and we think that way, and we need to think that way. But I don't think that's the whole game that's going on. I think there's a sense inside of us that says, wait a minute, I ought to tell the truth, even if this costs me something. So I'm not just looking for a transcendent source. I'm looking for an adequate source that best explains how we live and how we think and how we approach moral values. And I think an instrumental one, scratch my back, I scratch yours, gets us part of the way there, but misses what we mean. I'm sure you've told your kids growing up, why tell the truth? It's the right thing to do. And you want to be the kind of virtuous person. It's not just one, it's both. And so I think that's really the question.
Let me turn the microphone. I just spent 40 minutes and I wrote that chapter, 9,000 word chapter explaining how I derive these. What is your explanation? Why should we be truthful or loving or follow our promises? Or what's the source of morality in your worldview?
Fair question. So I would say God is the fount of morality. God is good. God is just. God is righteous. And he's given us commandments where we get our duties from. So morality is built into the fabric of the universe, so to speak. It's not something that I just have to assume to get my moral system going. If this, then that. No, built in is that God is morally good, just like the number.
But that's an assumption, McDowell. Like you're saying that. You can't just say it and then not have to defend it. How does he not see this? Like you might think it's fundamental to reality that God exists and God is good, but it's still an assumption in your worldview that you should defend, or just say, well, look, I'm not going to defend it. I'm just going to take it as an axiom. But in Shermer can just do the exact same thing. Either he can just take it as an axiom, however he grounds morality, or he can defend it. He can give reasons for why we should assume that. I don't understand what McDowell is actually saying. Like, am I the one who's missing something? Why does McDowell think he doesn't have to defend a claim when he says something like God is perfectly good and therefore that's where we get our morality from, or like that's where we get the normativity from? But Shermer doesn't. So McDowell doesn't have to defend that, but Shermer does have to defend it when he says that we can derive it from evolution or whatever else. I don't understand that. Where does the asymmetry come from? It's just different views. It's not somehow one needs to be defended and the other doesn't. Why would anyone think that?
Or two is necessarily even. God is just, God is holy, God is good. Now, I'm not making this up. This is a part of what the Judeo-Christian theistic system entails, is that God is the source of morality.
Craig says something similar to that as well. He says, like, well, Christians have always said that that God is the source of morality. It doesn't matter how long people have said something or whether they've always said it or not. That's irrelevant. The point is, what reasons do we have for thinking that it's true? So Shermer could just as well say, well, people have always said that morality comes from evolution. Like, I mean, they haven't, right? But it wouldn't matter if they have. That's just totally irrelevant to the justification of the claim. Why does it matter how long Christians have said something? This is such a bizarre point. Like, well, Hindus have said things longer than Christians have, so should we look at what they say? It's just irrelevant. Like, it doesn't matter if you're making it up. The question, like, okay, this is a good point. I'm not making this up equals someone made this up a long time ago. Yeah, like, it doesn't matter who made it up or what. The question is, what reasons are there for thinking that it's true? What an absolutely bizarre way to defend something.
And that our duties, our obligations to tell the truth come from God's commands, which we may know through consciousness, we might know through experience without Scripture, but we also know them through Scripture. Now, why does this matter? Because I think this view completely avoids the Euthyphro dilemma that you brought up. And I want to know what you think about this, because I believe it's about 400 years before Christ. Obviously, Euthyphro and Socrates debating the source of morality tied to the gods being loving and pious. And really simply stated is, do the gods command something because it's good, or is it good because the gods command it? Now, in one sense, we would say if something's good because he commands it, then morality seems arbitrary. And you lay that out in your article, I think, really well. If the source is simply God's will, then morality is arbitrary. But if God commands something because it's good, then that follows there's some authoritative source and existence outside of God, which threatens God's sovereignty and status as God, so to speak. So is it A or is it B? Now, I think the Euthyphro dilemma is a legitimate dilemma for certain Islamic views that have really God's commands alone as the source of morality. And I know some Christians might take that perspective. I think it's definitely challenging the day of Socrates to the Greek pantheistic view, or pantheon of gods, in which these gods were capricious, unpredictable. They were creatures in the universe. They were finite, and they did horrific things. It would apply to the gods of his day, but not the God that I'm claiming here, because God is just in his very character. So it's not arbitrary because his commandments flow out of his nature, but there's also not a standard outside of God because God is good. So I don't see why the Euthyphro dilemma undermines the divine command theory that I hold.
Okay. So my question then is, how do you know all this? Is this through Scripture from the Holy Book?
That's such a bad response, right? Because, well, okay, maybe I'm going too soon. Let's hear him out. I think that's a bad response. Because maybe he's going to say, what reasons do you have for thinking this? But that's not quite. Let me rephrase that. What Shermer should be critiquing is the reasons McDowell has in defense of his view, not exactly how he knows it. Like, those are slightly different claims, right? How you know something and how you defend it are not exactly the same. So what he should be asking not is exactly how McDowell knows all of this, because McDowell's going to say, well, God revealed it to us, right? That's not really what we're interested in. What we're interested in is, why should we take what McDowell is saying, or what reasons do we have for favoring that as a theory of ethics over, say, Shermer's view? That's what he should be getting at, which is a bit different to how do you know this? So that's why I think that's a bad response. But let's see what direction he takes.
Book? Is it from prayer, revelation, or just do you listen to this still small voice within, and that's God directing moral values to you, or how, just in your own words, how do you know all this?
Okay, so I'm gonna take somewhat of a step back here, because we're asking the question. Does God or science best explain good and evil and moral values? That's an ontological, metaphysical question about where morality comes from. The follow-up question, of course, is epistemological. How do we know? How do we know what's right and wrong? Mm-hmm. And that's where I think you and I agree, in a sense, that our moral experience, the effect on other people.
Yeah, and this is exactly what I thought. Because if you just ask, how do you know that, then you can make this argument, well, look, the epistemological question of how you know it is different from the question of what it is, right? So, and I think maybe this just comes from a lack of clarity on Shermer's part. He shouldn't be asking about how McDowell knows all of those things. He should be asking for him to justify the claims that he's making. Right? And those are related, but they are distinct, right? And so let's sort of ignore what Shermer said and go back to what McDowell said. So yeah, saying that God's justice is built in doesn't explain anything. And so this is the problem. You really need to unpack it. So let's take what McDowell says. McDowell said before that God's nature is to be perfectly good. So there's a few different directions you can take on this. One is to ask what that claim amounts to. So what is it about God's nature that makes God just or loving or forgiving or something? It seems like you can't just say, well, it's his forgivingness, because then you're saying, well, we ground forgivingness in God's forgivingness. Like, doesn't really make any sense. It's entirely circular. If it was a human being, you would say, well, what makes him loving is, and then you point to all of these like actions that they took. Or you point to their psychological disposition, like certain ways that they think about things or their attitudes towards other people. So you could ground it out in terms of actions and psychology, right? And so maybe you try to do that in terms of God as well. That would be interesting, but I've never heard anyone try to do that. And of course, you know, there's going to be a problem if you tried to do it that way. But usually there's no attempt. They just sort of say, well, God's nature is to be, and then insert X moral value. But then you end up with a sort of an empty claim, right? Because it's supposed to be a substantive claim to say that God is just, or God is loving, or God is good. But if goodness if goodness refers to whatever God's nature is, then it's not actually a substantive claim to say that God is good. It's just true by definition, and it's sort of entirely circular. And so I think that theists have trouble understanding the content of the claims that they're making when they say that God is just, loving, and perfect and good, because those claims actually don't have any referent outside of God's nature, according to them, and so therefore they seem kind of empty. And again, I think the route to avoid the way to get around this is to invoke divine simplicity, which is to say that God is goodness, right? Which sort of avoids this problem, but then causes a whole bunch of other problems. So that's one issue, right? It's effectively empty. You lose any semantic reference when you just say, well, God is good. God grounds goodness because God is perfectly good. As well, what does it mean that God is perfectly good? Well, that's just what he is. You don't have anything further to say. There's nothing further to appeal to. Whereas the naturalist who is attempting to ground goodness in terms of well-being, that is a substantive claim that they're making. They're saying, well, look, here's this thing, goodness, and here's this other thing, well-being, and we're saying that one refers to the other. But the theists don't actually seem to be saying anything. They seem to be, well, here's this thing, God's nature, or like part of God's nature, and here's this other thing, goodness, and goodness just is that bit of God's nature. Which bit of God's nature? Well, the bit that's good, well, the aspect of him that makes goodness. Well, but what? Like, you're not actually saying anything, it seems to me. So there's a circularity and emptiness to that claim. It makes it so that saying God is good actually doesn't really mean anything. It's just a sort of a tautology. Whereas it's supposed to be a substantive claim. We're supposed to be happy that God is good. Another way to think about this is if you can ask, you can sort of push the Euthyphro dilemma back another step, and you can say, is God's nature good because that's the way his nature is, or is his nature that way because that's what is good, right? So in other words, if God had a different nature, would that nature be good, or not? Right? It's effectively the same as asking about if God commanded something different, would that thing be good, or not? And now, theists will usually say, well, God's nature is necessary, right? But that's not really going to get you anywhere, because theists already think that God is necessary. So we can still ask, we can still consider epistemic possibilities. Well, epistemically, it's possible that there could be a being that had a different nature. And if that being with a different nature, therefore commanded different things on the basis of that different nature, would those things be good, right? And if the answer is no, they wouldn't be, then it seems like there's a fact of the matter outside God's nature that determines what is good. But if the answer is yes, those things would be good, then the arbitrariness problem comes back again. So just calling it God's nature actually doesn't solve any of these problems. It introduces a new problem that it becomes empty to say that God is good, right? Because there's no external reference to goodness outside of God. And so it's no longer a substantive claim. It's just sort of a meaningless tautology. But there's the additional problem that you can just recast the Euthyphro dilemma in terms of God's nature. Well, if God had a different nature, would that then be good or not, right? And you come back to the exact same problem again. So I don't think this shift to it's part of God's nature actually solves anything. It just makes the problem worse. Once again, the naturalist or atheist can just advance the divine, the ideal observer objection and just say, look, if there's a fact of the matter about what a perfectly good being would do, then that grounds morality. Like that can ground morality. We don't actually need them to exist because existing doesn't make any difference, right? It's just the fact. What we need to ground morality is an objective fact of the matter about what makes something good. And if that exists, like if there is a fact of the matter, then just appeal to that. So that would probably be the best way for Shermer to respond. So either by asking, look, if God had a different nature, would that nature then be good? Or well, if there's a fact of the matter about what a perfectly good being would, what their nature would be and what they would do and what they would want, then we can just appeal to that. And it doesn't matter whether they exist or not because the fact is still the fact. Again, God seems to only be necessary if he actually has to command something and we don't know what he would command. Like there's no fact of the matter about what God would command. It's just whatever he happens to actually command, right? Then you need God, right? Because you don't have any facts of the matter about what he would do. It's just what he actually does. You see the difference here. But if there's a fact of the matter about what a perfectly God would do, then just appeal to that directly. So this whole, well, just build it into God, it doesn't actually solve anything. Right? It's just wordplay, right? Instead of God's commands, it just says, well, it's part of God's nature. But that causes, I think that introduces a semantic issue about then the claim God is good is meaningless. And it doesn't solve the issue because you can ask, well, what if God's nature was different? Would that nature be good or not? It's a shame that Shermer doesn't seem to have thought through that. Yeah, this is another way to put what I'm saying. Are the attributes that make up God's nature good because God has them, or does he have them because they're good? Yeah, that's a clear way to put it. And the way around that is that I'm aware of, well, the only one I've really heard is to argue for divine simplicity, which is to say that actually God is identical to his attributes, and that would be equivalent to saying God is goodness, right? God is justice. And I just think that that's incoherent. And also typically Protestants don't appeal to divine simplicity, so I don't think McDowell would believe that. I do think it resolves that problem, but only by creating other ones. So sort of pick your poison. But anyway, yes. So this response of McDowell is a typical one that theists make or that apologists make. I don't think it solves any problem. If anything, it makes things worse because then you have this sort of semantic indefinability issue. But unfortunately, the direction Shermer has taken is not ideal because then it seems that he's not actually asking McDowell to defend his view. He's just asking, how do you know about your view, effectively? And then McDowell's able to say, well, it's just a separate question as to, the epistemic versus the ontological. This is the same thing Craig does. It's exactly out of Craig's book. And look, the issue here arises because I think apologists are being dishonest, whether they realize it or not. They're being dishonest when they do this because they haven't defended their position, right? And they're just trying to get out of defending their position while requiring the atheist to defend their position, which is intellectual dishonesty, right? In my opinion, whether you realize it or not, it's sort of maybe, sort of trained yourself to avoid realizing the fact that you're being dishonest. But the reason they can get away with this is because many of their interlocutors just haven't thought about the issue carefully enough and aren't sufficiently switched on or paying enough attention to realize that they've done this. And so they allow them to weasel out of having to actually defend their worldview. So, for example, we could ask, well, why is it that we should think that it's coherent to talk about a perfectly good being, and how do we link that then to human obligations? This is something that I said before. Why is it that human obligations would derive from a perfectly good being? What's the actual connection? Why do we think that is what human morality is even about? Maybe it will be a whole separate thing. Like how do we even say that there is that the very mundane business of human morality has anything to do with a perfect, omnipotent, and non-physical being? Like that seems to be so far removed from us that how can we even say that there's a connection between those? Like you need to make the argument about where the connection arises from. I mean, this is what I find bizarre because somehow apologists, seem to think that it's kind of silly to think that morality is about human well-being, but then they say, oh, but it's just makes obviously more sense to say that human morality is about or is grounded by, a timeless, spaceless, omnipotent, omniscient, non-physical mind, which is so much further removed from and different from human morality that I sort of don't know why you would think that that's a more plausible grounding of morality than just human well-being, which seems much more directly connected to well-being. Like the example I give to sort of illustrate this point is to say that if you see someone in grave suffering, like being attacked or beaten or something like that, you look at what's happening there, and I mean, ideally, you'd sort of feel some empathy, right? But irrespective of that, we can sort of cognize that something bad is happening there. And the reason why something bad is happening is because of facts about that person and what's happening to them and their experiences. And I think that then allows us to see the link to human well-being as connected to morality, right? But the theists wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but they would say ultimately what makes that wrong is something wholly removed from any of this, some omniscient, omnipotent, non-spatial, non-physical mind that exists wholly apart from us and is, radically different from us, ontologically, right? Now, to say that's a more plausible grounding of what makes it wrong for this person to be beaten up than the fact that they're suffering and that's a fact about human being. To say that the non-physical mind is more plausibly related to this than just the experiences of that person, I think is utterly bizarre, and I think counts against the theory that McDowell is advocating for. It's just less plausible. It's less obviously relevant to the discourse of morality, which obviously relates to humans and our interactions with other people, and everyone agrees with that, right? But then we're somehow trying to bring in this transcendent other to ground it. I think it's just an uphill battle to argue what relevance that has to anything, even if you thought it existed, even if you thought such a thing existed. So anyway, that's a sort of a different way of looking at it. And the issue again is that if we're not clear about requiring the theists to justify these positions, then they can weasel out of it, just like it seems that that McDowell is managing to do.
Etc. is a way that we can know. So to answer the Euthyphro dilemma, I'm not making this up. I'm just pulling from the Christian tradition of who God is and what moral commandments he's given us. And I think it splits the horns of the dilemma on Euthyphro. We could come back to how we know, but I think there's some preliminary questions we have to ask first to see if whether we need God or whether science itself can give us an objective moral standpoint. So before we go on, does my response adequately solve the Euthyphro dilemma? It's not arbitrary. There's not a standard outside of God. I haven't answered how we know things, but that's irrelevant.
I think that was a good response. Yes, I do. But that's why I asked the next follow-up question. But how do you know that? Because again, back to where we began, fallibilism. We're all fallible. You're not God, neither am I.
Agree.
So how do we know these things? I could be wrong. The entire theory I just present, you could be wrong.
Sure.
And you could be wrong. And we could ask a Muslim, what they think is the right moral values, and they'll make an argument similar to yours. So an anthropologist from Mars that's studying earthly religions would say, well, the Muslims say this and the Christians say this about whatever the moral issue is, and they differ. So how can I tell which is the right one? And of course, to me, it's like, well, that's not the right question. They're not right in that sense, some cosmic sense. These are each created their own moral systems from their historical trajectories as religions. That's, they got some stuff right, they got some stuff wrong, and and so on. That's anyway.
Okay, so I think your skepticism is coming through here, which is very fitting for a lot of reasons. I hear you. Let's go back to the article. And here's how I look at it. I could be wrong. Of course, I'll concede that. You could be wrong. Maybe there's a third view, and maybe the Hindus or Buddhists are right, and we're both mistaken, Michael. But I think what we owe to people watching this is to make our case, clarify the differences, and let people decide if they think science is adequate to explain, or if we need some kind of theistic grounding.
So what McDowell said is all perfectly fair there, except McDowell hasn't made any case. All he's done is assert his view about the nature of morality and its connection to God. And that's largely what Shermer has done as well. What McDowell doesn't realize, the problem is McDowell doesn't realize that. McDowell thinks apparently that he's defended his view, but Shermer hasn't. Whereas in fact, I think neither of them has really defended their view. I think Shermer's sort of tried a bit more than McDowell has, largely because he just sort of said more. And McDowell's been pressuring him more than Shermer has. But at best, McDowell has articulated his position, but that's not the same as defending the position. So why should we think that morality has anything to do with God's commands? It's not enough just to say, well, this is what Christians have always said. That's not actually a reason, right? It's fair enough to ask Shermer, why should we think that morality has anything to do with human well-being or human flourishing? And I don't know that Shermer was really successful in articulating that. He said a few things that I think got it part of the way there, but wasn't really very well thought through. Other philosophers, I think, have done a better job at this. But McDowell really didn't make any effort to explain why we should think that morality has any relationship to God's nature or his commands. He just sort of said, that's what Christians say. Okay, well, secular humanists say what Shermer said. Like, what does that have to do with anything? this has to be something that he's just heard, like William Lane Craig says, and hasn't thought about it. Because if you think about it for 2 seconds, anyone should realize that's not a reason for thinking something or for defending something, that's what my people, like people who agree with me, have always said. Okay, what does that have to do with anything? So it's disappointing here, because I kind of agree with McDowell's framing of what the discussion is supposed to be about, but McDowell just seems to have missed the point that that isn't what the discussion has been. Really, we've just heard two people articulating their views, but not trying to defend them. And by trying to defend them, I mean, yes, you do need to articulate them, but you need to give reasons as to why we should think that they are true, right? Why your view is better than the alternative view. And then we should either give, deductive arguments, or look at explanatory criteria and see which is better fulfilled by one versus the other. Look at our background beliefs and see which of them better cohere with each position. Look at problems within the view and see which has more internal inconsistencies. Like, this is all of the ways we can assess different positions here, and that hasn't really been done. I think it's been done a bit more by Shermer, largely because McDowell has pushed him a bit more. So we've had a little bit of that on Shermer's side, but I think not very much, or not done very well, because Shermer typically responds just by reasserting his position and not clearly explaining the issues or working through. And McDowell, I think, hasn't really done that at all. He's simply asserted his view and then said he doesn't have to defend it because that's what Christians have always said. And that's pretty lame, really. It's really quite lame.
So one of the points you make in the article is related to individuals and their rights. So I want to know, do individual human beings, and we could talk about other sentient beings, but let's just focus on human beings, do they have value and worth, and where does that come from? And here's a quote just to give us some context. This is on page 4 of the article you sent me. He said, it is individuals who are entitled to rights, not races, genders, ethnicities, religions, or nations, because it is individuals who perceive, emote, respond, love, feel, and most notably suffer. Now, for the record, you and I agree that rights are things humans have, and it shouldn't vary based on race or gender or religion. That's common ground. We're not asking if we share that. I'm asking what adequately accounts for and grounds human rights, especially since they're not physical things like atoms and molecules that seemingly science can study. And it seems to me when you say we have rights, because humans can perceive, emote, respond, we're back to getting an ought from an is, and I think the fallacy's at play. You disagree? Yeah, tell me why.
Very nice.
But again, what's McDowell going to say? Well, because humans are made in the image of God, or because God says so. Those are just ises, right? And you can't get around it by just saying, well, that's what Christians have always said, so I don't have to defend it. That's not a defense. I'm not really convinced that Shermer's going to say much that's very coherent here. My personal view about rights, by the way, is that they're rather problematic. I need to do more reading about this because I haven't focused a lot on rights as an idea. The notion of natural rights goes back a bit further, but like human rights, in the way that we understand it, really goes back to the French Revolution with the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. It's quite a modern, I think, Enlightenment concept. But there are, of course, antecedents, like there are with many other things. But anyway, we can talk about that. But so I tend to think that rights are a socio-political construct, which is grounded in moral claims, but in itself is not kind of morally fundamental. So I think to say that someone has a right to something is to say something about the society and the political system that they live in and the way it should be structured. And so it is relative in some sense to the society that they live in. I mean, if you look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, most of the rights that are there, or in other bills of rights as well, really don't make any sense if you think about them in a pre-industrial society. Like the right to a speedy trial or trial by jury. What does that even mean in a pre-industrial society that doesn't have jury trials, right? Or, the right to healthcare, or the right to freedom of press. Like, what do any of those things mean in a pre-industrial context? So there may be some exceptions, like the right to life, perhaps. But broadly speaking, I think most rights are quite sort of culturally and politically and economically contingent on the society that they exist in. And that's kind of fine, because I think their purpose is ultimately sort of socio-political. So I think they can be grounded and they should be grounded with reference to facts about human well-being, human flourishing, so that there's a moral connection there. But I guess the point is, I personally don't think that rights can do a lot of fundamental work for them in terms of grounding moral claims. So I wouldn't try to defend rights. Let me rephrase that. I wouldn't try to defend moral claims or normativity or ethical realism by appealing to human rights, because I don't think the relationship goes in that direction. I would try to defend human rights by first trying to defend moral realism of some form, and then appeal to human rights as effectively a political tool for for promoting human well-being in a particular socio-political context. And so, so that's a form of relativism, if you like, but relativism specifically about rights. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that I don't think that people in like non-Western countries have human rights, because the nature of the relativity is such that other societies are more than capable of protecting those rights if their social and political institutions were arranged in such a way. It's just to say that they're not, they don't have the same universality as I think facts about human well-being do, which can apply irrespective of the time and place. Rights are more specifically relating to certain ways of fulfilling or promoting human well-being, like the examples I gave before, right? I think like trial by jury is a classic example of something that, or a speedy trial. It's sort of hard to say that there's something about human nature by itself that gets you to that right. It seems like that you also need a certain political context for that to even make sense. And likewise for many other rights. Maybe not all of them, but at least most of the rights that you see in many of these compilations. Anyway, so that's one of the reasons why I don't actually like talking about human rights in these sorts of discussions, because I personally don't think human rights have much of a meta-ethical significance. That in other words, they don't much relate to the grounds of morality or the meaning of moral claims. They're sort of secondary. They're more like applied ethics. And this is how I see it discussed more, although I would say that I'm not really an expert on human rights, but typically I don't see it discussed much in like the meta-ethics space. But of course, you might think differently. You might want to try to ground things in human rights first and then argue for something else later. That's fine. Like you can argue for different positions, but I don't think one has to do that. Like you don't just have to assume that human rights have some sort of fundamental existence or that they're needed to justify other things. That's an assumption, right? So again, you need to compare the different views. So I think McDowell is kind of putting Shermer in a position here where he feels like he has to defend the fundamental existence or status of human rights, whereas I don't think a realist needs to do that. You can in fact reject human rights and say there's no such thing as human rights and still be a moral realist, because rights aren't the same thing as morality, right? That it's a particular way of looking at or thinking about morality or normativity. So again, it's about keeping these things separate and understanding the relationship between them. And I think that there's often a lack of clarity there, including in this discussion, even.
Very nice. Yeah, you're very sharp on this. A couple of things. First, I'm not saying it's just science. I think of science as a branch of philosophy. I'm just talking about all of philosophy, all of human knowledge. I'm not saying you should go to the ichthyologist to figure out what's the right moral position on abortion. I mean, just the entirety of human knowledge, of which science is just a part, right? A lot of it is logic, reason, deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and so on. Okay. Which when people think of science, they think of the guy in the lab coat, whatever. I'm just talking about everything. Okay. Then I guess I would from there say that we're trying to derive what I think of as, again, like Platonic ideas. They really exist. Rights really exist. Now, setting aside that, again, in part, I'm arguing against some utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham, who famously said rights are nonsense and natural rights are nonsense on stilts. I disagree with that. I think natural rights really exist as part of our nature, by my human nature that I inherited from my species, that bodily autonomy, choice, the right not to be tortured and killed, and the right to my own privacy and property, the right to the fruits of my labor. These things that are largely articulated by the founding fathers in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. They're not dummies, and they were not just philosophers.
I wonder if he would include the right to own firearms as something that's sort of given to him by the nature of being a human. And this is why I think it's sort of problematic to try to give human rights the sort of fundamental role that Shermer is giving them here, because most of them seem very contextual in what they actually talk about. And maybe the right to not be harmed physically by someone else, maybe you could say that's much broader, but I don't think there are, if that is all, let me rephrase that. If you're going to require that level of sort of universality, then I don't think you're going to get very many rights. And some people are okay with that. That's like, yeah, there's like 3 rights. Life, liberty, property. Like that's all it is. Although I say property is a sort of socio-political construct as well. A very useful one, by the way, but I still don't, I mean, like Locke famously talked about this, right? Where it's like you don't have property in the initial state of nature. You get property when a human mixes, like a person mixes their labor with the fruits of nature, and then like by picking a fruit or harvesting the ground, or like planting and harvesting grain or something like that, and they mix their labor, and then then that gives them a certain right to something. So even there's sort of a context in which our behavior interacting with the environment gives rise to the right, and not just us by ourselves. Anyway, I'm getting a bit off topic here, but it's just really complicated when you want to give a grounding of human rights and in virtue of what is something a right. And if you're going to say that it's something about like the human species or evolution, then I don't think you're going to get very many rights that way. Especially many of the, like privacy, it's a pretty dubious one, and many others that are in the American Bill of Rights that don't really seem to have much of any bearing on that. So I'm not really very sympathetic with Shermer on this, but again, I don't think McDowell's in any better position. Like, well, how does he ground them? Well, because God says that humans have these rights. Well, that's not any better of an argument. Like, you need to defend that. Why do we have them just because God says so? Why does God being our creator mean that we have rights in virtue of that? Like, if God didn't create us, would we not have these rights? You can ask all these sorts of questions.
Philosophers just making stuff up. I mean, there was no science in those days. It was just natural philosophy. I mean, the great Isaac Newton, it was so idea that signals to these. I think you ground what we mean by individual rights and human value and human dignity. And of course, I agree with you on my concern with identity politics, the right to speech, so many things you mentioned. Like, I agree with you on those things. I think you and I probably agree on more things than we differ if we step back and considered everything.
It looks like we missed an anti-woke rant, but we can deal without that. I mean, I'm a fan of free speech as well, but anyway.
But the question here, when we say what difference does it make, is we're trying to get a worldview that describes the world as it actually is. We're trying to ask, do we just have these feelings that we have rights that have bubbled up through some evolutionary process, or do we actually have such obligations? Now, I would venture to say that you live your life as if you really have obligations to people, to your neighbor, to the poor, to people of different religions. Everything I know about you is that you're trying to live a good moral life and treat people with dignity and respect. That tells me that there's something deeper going on, that we really believe that these things are real. And that's a better way to live than somebody who doesn't believe in those things. And so I'd argue when we say,
isn't that what Shermer thinks? He thinks they are really real. He just thinks that they're grounded or generated and grounded by evolution and human nature. It's not like that those things don't exist, right? They're real, right? They're really real. Real with a capital R. It's just they're different things to appeal to than what McDowell wants to appeal to. So I see apologists do this a lot as well, right? Where the atheist will give some sort of explications to where they think morality or value or purpose or whatever comes from. And then the theist will respond by saying, yeah, but I don't think you really believe that because you act as if they're really real. As if what the atheist said in some way means that they're not real. And by the way, this applies even if you're a subjectivist about morality, because this is what people say. They think subjective means not real. Subjective doesn't mean not real. It just means that if something is true subjectively, or it's a subjective fact, it means that its truth or its existence is dependent on the attitudes or mindset or beliefs or desires or whatever, like the mindset in some ways of a particular agent or a subject more generally. But it's still real. Like, something that is subjective is still real. There's a big difference between subjective and non-existent, right? So even someone who is a subjectivist about morality would think that it's really real. It's just subjective, which may mean that it differs by people or culture or time, right? But it's still real. So this is not actually difficult to understand. It's just that you need a certain amount of, you need to have read a certain amount and thought about things clearly. So McDowell here, I think this is a silly objection. Obviously, Shermer thinks that these things are really real. He just thinks that they're real in virtue of different things or in a different way than McDowell thinks they're real. And so what we need to do is assess and adjudicate who has the better theory, who has the better arguments. What reasons do we have for favoring one over the other? Not say, well, mine is really real and yours isn't really real. Like, this is just silly. This is just posturing. Well, I mean, this is right. So this is another example, right? I don't think most people are realists about the value of money, but it would be weird to say that money doesn't really exist or doesn't really have value. So neoclassical economics is sort of notoriously or famously subjectivist about value, in that they say that things have value solely because people place value on them, and not in virtue of any objective properties of the things in question. So that's a subjectivist view about value. And money, I think you can understand the value of money in much the same sense. Money has value because people place value on it, right? It's entirely subjectivist. There's obviously no mind-independent fact of the matter about how much money is worth. I think everyone would agree with this. The value of money doesn't come from God or aliens or something else. It comes from human attitudes, effectively, and behaviors that manifest those attitudes. So it's not subjective. It's not dependent on any single person's attribution of value. If you doubt that, try inventing your own currency and telling everyone what it's worth. One person's opinion is not enough to make it worth something. But when a sort of a sufficient group of people come to place value on something, then it begins to have value, right? Just look at cryptocurrency. But anyway, the point is that this is actually a good example to see about the difference between something being subjective. In this case, the value of money is subjective in the sense that it's value that arises because of human interactions and human mental states, opinions, effectively. It's everyone's opinion that money has value, so therefore it has value. Not individual humans, but humans collectively, or subsets of humans. But that doesn't mean it isn't real. It doesn't mean it's somehow fake, which is what the sort of gold standard people miss, because they somehow think that gold, some of them somehow think that gold has intrinsic value, which it doesn't. But like plastic or paper money doesn't. And then think that their whole money system is therefore built on cards because it has no sort of objective foundation. But we should go back to gold because gold has an objective foundation and objective value. That's all nonsense, right? Gold is not objectively valuable in any way that paper or digital or whatever other type of currency isn't. It's all based on people's attitudes, values, and opinions and behaviors. So it's subjective in this way. But again, I think everyone should be able to understand that that doesn't mean that it isn't real. It doesn't mean that money doesn't have value. Like clearly it does. Clearly it does. Money has a function, and that function is to facilitate exchange and the storage of value and calculation, things like that. And it fulfills that function well in general cases. I mean, there's hyperinflation when it fails to fulfill that function. Because it fulfills that function, people place value on it, right? It serves its function well, and so people value it. That's why it's valuable. So this is just a very clear example of something that is real and very much exists, but is in some sense entirely subjective. And so this is something like what moral anti-realists think, or at least some of them. There's many varieties. Something like what moral anti-realists might think about morality, that it's real and true. It's just its existence is entirely dependent on what humans think about it. I personally don't agree with that because I think there are some differences between human well-being and money, which we could talk about. But maybe some of those differences are subtle in some of these points, because I do think that morality relates to human well-being, or at least the well-being of sentient beings, let's say. And so if there weren't any sentient beings in the universe, then morality would kind of be sort of redundant, or it wouldn't refer to anything. But the difference is that I don't think that it's what makes something morally valuable isn't any person's, or even collectively any group of people's opinion about that, which is where it differs from money. So this is actually kind of useful, right? Maybe to illustrate the difference between realism and anti-realism here. So as a naturalist and a realist, I think that human well-being grounds moral claims. It's what makes things morally valuable. It's not anyone's opinion or views about human well-being. It's the well-being itself. Money is different because it's explicitly people's views and opinions about the value of money that gives it value. In both cases, the value is real, right? That the monetary value and the moral value, they're both real. It's just one is dependent on people's attitudes and opinions. That's the money case, and therefore it's subjective value. Whereas, in my opinion, the value of human well-being is not dependent on anyone's opinion. It's valuable just because of its being well-being, right? And therefore it's objective. Now, of course, there are people who would disagree with me and say, no, moral values only are valuable because of people's opinions, right? Collectively as a society or as separate societies. And so it's more like money than it is like other objective things, right? So it depends on your position. But in both cases, they think it's real, and this is critical. McDowell doesn't seem to understand this. He seems to think that the only real morality is that comes from God, and everything else is somehow a fake morality, which is just silly, right? Like that's just sort of assuming that your view is the only one that could even possibly be true. Everyone thinks that morality exists in some form, or at least nearly everyone, except unless you're an error theorist. They're sort of the main exception here. They're the ones who say morality is bunk and it's all false. But subjectivists aren't error theorists. They think morality is real. It's just subjective. And Shermer thinks that morality is real and objective. He just thinks it's not from God. And both of those people, therefore, are going to say it's real. And McDowell just saying, well, you don't think that it's real. It's just he's just not listening to what they actually think. So anyway, yeah, value of art, another example we could talk about. But I'm just trying to emphasize the point here that there's often a conflation of different things. And subjective doesn't mean not real. Also, non-transcendent doesn't mean not real either. And there's a lot of confusion that I see about this. And really, it's unfortunate that a discussion like this we can't see a bit more clarity. Comment here, I think it's helpful to avoid terms like objective and subjective or real exists. Seems like giving a description of stances and clarifying whether or not something depends on stances works well. Yeah, because these terms are so commonly misunderstood, it's probably better to just explain what you mean clearly, right? So I can say that money has value in the sense that people regard it as having value and think it has value and act as if it has value, and therefore that gives it value. That is what makes it have value. Whereas I would argue that human well-being has value, but not because whether people think of it or not, just because it is well-being. And so I could say that's a difference. I would call that difference subjective versus objective, but that label may not be helpful. So you just forget about it and explain your position. Yeah, I think often that's better than using highly contested and controversial terms. Probably should finish up soon. It's getting a bit late here, but and we've gotten an hour through, which is pretty good. And I think we've probably gotten about as much out of Shermer as we're going to. I might just skip around a little bit in the last bit and see if there's anything juicy that I want to cover.
Say, what difference does it make? It's not that I'm trying to reach in, the afterlife, heaven or hell. That's not the point. The question is, do we have built within the system as it is a way to explain rights, a way to explain value, human intrinsic value, not just instrumental value? And of course, within the Judeo-Christian systems, there's God who's made us in his image. And so why should I care about the poor? Because the poor don't just have instrumental value. They're made in God's image. And I should treat them kindly. Why should I care about orphans? Well, because they're made
what does that mean?
in God's image.
What does that mean?
So let me finish this and I'll come back to it, because there's big debate about what it means. Is that my only point is that you're talking about these things about rights and values, which are not physical.
Well, then it's not really very useful to appeal to in this sort of discussion with Shermer, is it? I'm actually glad you mentioned that, because that's one that I really hate. The Christians and others will... I don't know, did Jews even say this? Well, it is in the Old Testament, right? Anyway, it feels like Christian apologists mostly say this, though, that, well, we're made in God's image. But never actually explain what that means. And then even if you explain what it means, you can ask, well, why does it matter if we're made in God's image or not? Why does that mean we have rights? And maybe McDowell would just say, well, Christians have always said that, as if that's some sort of response. Let's hope it comes back to it, because I'm interested.
Physical, they're not material. It's not clear to me how these bubble up within evolution and have any ontological status. And I think, by the way, I'm going to come back to your question. I'm not avoiding it, but I think one of the differences is we're using the term objective here, but mean different things by it. So when I did a little reading on meta-ethical theory, just to make sure I understood, and objective means that something exists, morally speaking, whether anybody believes it or not. And so gravity, for example, whether everybody came not to believe in gravity.
So that definition is actually problematic for divine command theory views, because it seems that God's belief about it is actually what makes it true. So in fact, at least according to some classifications, theological voluntarist views are actually subjectivist theories of morality for this exact reason, that at least God's view of the matter is what constitutes the fact of the matter, and therefore it actually is subjective. It may not be subjective in a human sense, but it is still dependent on the attitudes of an agent. Now, I think the way that McDowell talks about it is that it's God's nature and not God's opinion as such, although you could ask what's the difference between those. But anyway, I actually think McDowell's view is more subjective than Shermer's is, because Shermer doesn't appeal to anyone's opinions. He appeals to facts about human nature, which are independent of what humans think about that nature, and this is something that McDowell doesn't seem to understand. But yeah, I always think this is sort of ironic when Christians say that their reality is more objective, when in fact it is dependent on the on an agent or a person, as they think God is a person, in a way that ethical naturalists don't think that their morality is. And so, if anything, theirs is more subjective. But again, I don't know that it's that helpful to bandy around this term as we discussed.
Gravity, or people died. Gravity is an objective feature of the world itself. It's what we call mind independent.
Yep.
And so what I'm hearing from you is that there's certain beliefs that we have about rights and values comes through evolution. And I'd say, sure, we have those beliefs, but those aren't grounded in anything a part of the fabric of the world itself.
So McDowell, I think, is just wrong here, right? And this is, I mean, Catholics say this as well, like traditionally, that human nature isn't dependent on human opinions, right? You can have whatever opinion you want about human nature, but you can be wrong. Like, human nature is the way it is. And again, by human nature here, we mean all of the different functionings and aspects of what it is to be human, and the things that contribute to us doing well and doing poorly, right? I explained that sort of before. Shermer is sloppy in the way he talks about this, but I think the point is that human nature is objective, right? And this is typically what the ethical naturalist would appeal to. Human nature is objective because human nature is the way it is, regardless of what anyone thinks about it. It's determined by the way people are. And so that is why ethical naturalism is taken to be a form of moral realism, is because it appeals to facts that aren't dependent on anyone's opinion. And this is, in fact, why at least some forms of theological voluntarism are held to be subjectivist, because what makes things right or wrong under those views is actually the opinions of an agent, namely God. And so they're more subjectivist than the ethical naturalist views of people like Shermer. But the fundamental misunderstanding is McDowell seems to think that, and partly Shermer is to blame because he's inconsistent when he talks about this, McDowell seems to think that it's our opinions about human nature that ground ethical claims according to the ground morality according to the naturalist. But a moral naturalist, well, I don't think should say that, or generally won't say that, because that's really not an ethical naturalist view. What they would say is that it's human nature itself that grounds morality. It's not our opinions about human nature. It's not what we think it is. It's what it actually is, right? I mean, I don't think this is that difficult a point.
Those are just feelings that have bubbled up. So if people go away or arguably change those beliefs, then those moral values actually change. So we don't really have rights. We don't really have objective values in the way gravity does that moral realists claim when they're talking about moral realism. These are just, again, feelings that exist in the world. And we're back to the point, practically speaking, why do we have an obligation to follow those feelings, especially if they're inconvenient?
Yeah, nice. Yeah, you kind of echoed Philip K. Dick's famous line there, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away.
Well
and
said.
I would apply that to rights. Rights is not just something made up by Westerners. And, we have no business telling people in other nations how they should or shouldn't live their lives. I think they really exist, and that there's a reason the directionality of history is toward more and more countries adopting rights. So I was like 100 plus countries now have constitutions similarly written to the U.S. Constitution. I mean, they literally took it and do, like, again, to use this example, this want to, our women covered up so the men can't. You want to, be forced to not be allowed to drive and vote and so on. Again, we ought to help these people. Now, as a practical issue, America can't be the world, right? So we do the best we can. We have a moral obligation to help people that can't help themselves, but Uyghurs in China.
So, trust, you said more countries have rights than did in the past.
Shermer is terrible at engaging in philosophical discussions. Like, I'm not sure I ever thought he was great at this. I thought he was better at kind of the skeptical stuff. But watching this, he just didn't address anything that McDowell said. I know I skipped over it a bit, but you heard what he was talking about. It just in no way addressed anything that McDowell said, which is disappointing because I think it's very easy to respond to what McDowell said and simply say, what Shermer should have said is, what makes something right or wrong is facts about human nature and well-being. Those facts are not dependent on anyone's opinions about them. It's those facts themselves, and therefore that is objective. And then you should have thrown it back to McDowell. It seems that on McDowell's view, morality is subjective because it depends on what God says about it or what God thinks about it. And then the discussion could have proceeded there, right? But again, it's like Shermer doesn't really want to think about this too hard. He just sort of wants to go and make his canned responses and talk about the sort of the socio-political aspects of it. Yes, and it would be good for Sean to talk about that. That's kind of really what I'm waiting for here, because I think I've probably, as I said, gotten as much out of Shermer as I'm going to, and probably as much out of McDowell as I'm going to about many of the other issues. But it would be good to hear that, because that is one of these, in my opinion, thought-terminating cliches that Christians say that allegedly does work, but I don't actually think really means anything. And look, if anything, it actually hurts their position, right? Because if being made in the image of God means something like we're capable of reasoning or being conscious or experiencing things, like anything like that, then all the atheist has to do is say, yes, those things are why humans are valuable, right? It's those properties. And I talk about this in my book. I criticize Craig in saying that he believes in intrinsic moral value, because he doesn't. Craig does not think that humans have intrinsic moral value. He thinks that they have moral value in virtue of their relationship to God. That's a relational claim. An intrinsic claim relates to the kind of internal properties. I mean, there's some debates about this, but it's the properties of something in and of itself that makes it what it is. And so the ethical naturalist is the one saying that humans have intrinsic value. They say, look, we have value in virtue of the way we are organized and the way we work and what makes us the way we are, right? You know, psychology, biology, and all that stuff. The theists, or at least people like McDowell, they say, no, those things aren't enough. Like, all of those facts could be the way they are, but we still don't have moral value. We only get moral value because of our relationship to a creator. That's not intrinsic value. That's relational or derived value. It's value that exists in virtue of a relation between two things, not in virtue of things of the thing in itself. Do you see the difference? So again, the ethical naturalist, I think, has the greater claim towards believing in the intrinsic value of human beings than the type of divine command theorist that McDowell is. But you know, it's unfortunate that that never is brought out in these discussions because, again, many of the atheists don't seem to have thought through these issues properly.
In the past, and I know you've written a whole book on this, The Moral Arc. I'll trust your analysis on that. I have no problem for that, but it sounds like we're saying there is moral objective improvement that is taking place here. It's better that there's more. That I agree with that, but I still don't see the binding obligation for that comes within a naturalistic universe. I'm still not seeing it. Well, in a sense, that does make morality subjective then. That means I'm bound towards asking people, and what they say will inform me in the moral good. Now, I agree with you that we should ask people and listen to them. That's a good moral principle.
I think McDowell's contradicting himself here, because the fact that you ask someone how they want to be treated and they tell you that could give you information about how to treat them, but that doesn't necessarily constitute the facts. It doesn't give the grounding as to in virtue of why they have moral value, right? Someone doesn't have moral value under the ethical naturalist view because they ask to be treated in some way. They have value perhaps in virtue of the fact that they're a human being or that they're capable of experiencing flourishing or whatever. And then you ask them how they want to be treated, which gives you information to help your decision about how to treat them. So again, he's confusing the epistemological with the ontological issue here, which is the point that he made before about keeping those distinct. But again, I mean, I skipped over a bit where I assume Shermer mentioned, well, you can ask people how they want to be treated, but this is sort of Shermer's fault for not keeping it distinct himself. But yeah, I really, all I want at this point is for McDowell to address the question as to what it means for us to be made in God's image. So I'm going to see if I can find that
principle. But that makes sense if I'm called to love people, and people are made in God's image, have intrinsic value, and duties are objective parts of the world in which we live. That makes sense. I still don't see why I'm bound to care within naturalism how anybody else feels if it doesn't benefit me, why anybody else has rights, especially if I can gain more in the process. But then it would seem to imply on the flip side of this, that if we could talk people into believing certain things that are not really in their best interest, but they believe it, then we justify different treatments of people on the system that you're kind of setting up here. So you say this at the end of your article, and I'd love your thoughts on this. You said, first off, you say, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Totally wrong. So that one day scientists may discover that humans do not mean that large populations of people don't object to being liquidated in gas chambers. Not on my system, that I think, and that's not in their objective good, even if they believe it. That's why I think the idea of grounding rights in asking people what they think and what they want isn't actually as objective if the people change their beliefs.
But that's just silly, because that's not what Shermer argued, right? He argued that the moral status of humans is grounded in human nature and evolution. And both of those things exist independently of what people think about it. Now, I think Shermer himself hasn't thought about it clearly enough, because then he appeals to asking people how they want to be treated. By the way, I actually don't think that that's a good ground of much of anything, because people don't always know what's in their own interest. It's a helpful thing to know about, right? To listen to what people want, but it actually doesn't get you nearly as far as I think maybe Shermer does. And there are many types of beings for whom it's completely inadequate, like children, intellectually disabled people, animals. You can't actually ask them how they want to be treated, or they won't give you a very informative response. And in fact, historically, many poorly educated peoples, like peasants and slaves, they objected to their position, or they experienced the suffering with their position, but they didn't necessarily have the relevant concepts or know how to articulate them to be able to actually articulate how they would like to be treated or what they would want to happen in society. So this is actually how you get positions where often the peasants would be very conservative. They supported like the Tsar or the Kaiser or whoever, partly because they just sort of didn't know any better. They didn't understand the relationship between the suffering they experienced and the position of the the socio-political institutions that kept them in that position. So they may be able to identify and if you ask them like what problems they had, they would identify just very sort of surface level things that they experienced directly, like a lack of food or the tax man taking too many things. And so they didn't identify the actual underlying issues of their societies. I mean, this is sort of what Karl Marx, the point that he made, right? Like that people didn't understand the underlying issues, that it was like the material conditions of society and the structure of production and ownership and so forth. And I think that there's some logic to that, even if I disagree with the particulars that he said about it. But the point is, just asking people about how they want to be treated doesn't actually always get you that far. So I think we need to appeal to other things beyond that. But the point is that Shermer wasn't even arguing that. He was arguing that you look at human nature, you look at evolution, those things are not dependent on what humans think about them. And therefore, this charge of subjectivism just doesn't seem to follow here. Let's see what Shermer says in response.
Yeah, interesting. So here, I guess the history of religion and rights and philosophy and so on makes a difference. I'm arguing in the moral arc that these kind of Enlightenment arguments from reason and rationality about rights and duties and so on, and the structure of society, democracy and whatnot, separation of powers, are grounded in an understanding of human nature and what societies are really like in history. Again, the founding fathers were very learned; they read everything.
So he sort of in a roundabout way said what I just said, but I think he's just then going to ramble on and not make the point clearly, which is that what grounds the moral status isn't an opinion about human nature or society. It is the human nature and the facts about society themselves, which are not subjective. That's what he really needs to hammer home.
Because there wasn't that much to read, something like that, Christian worldview. The people before that, Christians before that, would not be speaking the way you're speaking. Did it 700 years ago and did it. That's today, which it's been a hard one. I mean, the rights revolution, these both happened slow enough you can't barely see it. It's like a decay getting place I'm getting.
Done. We are relativism relativists. We have not. Okay, fair enough. So if it comes from culture, upbringing, and society, then when it's all said and done, we are relativists. We have not escaped a relativistic morality, and then all the critiques we could talk about of relativism would apply to your position. If there's no fixed standard of right and wrong that transcends culture, transcends time. Now, is because there is a standard of goodness. There is a standard of human value. There's a way we really should treat people across culture and across time. And when Christians of all people violate that, that should sear us, and that should give us pause. So
yeah, I'm not really commenting here because there's nothing really new. Notice that McDowell never actually defends his position. He never gives us reasons for accepting it as true. He just states what his position is, and generally not even very much detail, which again is disappointing because McDowell is calling on Shermer to say more about justifying his view, but again, apparently not realizing that he needs to do the same thing. But I've made that point before, so I'm just going to see if I can find any explanation of what it means to be made in God's image.
I fully recognize that because there's a lot of people believe things differently than you and I did. That's physical disability, if really wrong, even though they thought it was right. That number one, we still got to ground flourishing, which sentiments at that time, they thought they were real, rejected your feelings.
I can't say I wouldn't have done the same had I lived then. So that's our as best we can. And whatever. It didn't say anything about abortion, for example. So in 1966, he passed the most liberal abortion law in the
first part about your response when I asked about was, somebody who leaves a child to hurt, I'm not in those person's shoes. I really appreciate that. But it's an important area of agreement I want to point out. Now, you still did say you believe it's wrong, though. So there is kind of a standard of right. What's interesting is it's never been a debate amongst Christians that all human beings have intrinsic worth and are made in the image of God. It's never been a debate that we're supposed to protect the most vulnerable amongst us. That's why James writes, this is good religion, to care for widows and to care for orphans. In that culture, they didn't have the instrumental value of society, so they were deemed worthless. And Christians came along 2,000 years ago, consistent with their Jewish roots of the Old Testament that said, wait a minute, from the beginning, everybody, regardless of race, regardless of biological sex, wealthy, poor, whatever, married, not married, has value. Now, have Christians been inconsistent how they've applied this? Sure, of course. So moral practice has maybe changed, and we could talk about the 70s and 80s and 90s, moral majority, all that stuff. That's a separate conversation. But those grounded moral principles from the Old Testament and from the New Testament, those have not changed. And those are there long before the Enlightenment and could make the case that even ground things like tolerance. Why should I be tolerant of you? Because you're a human being with value beliefs, even if friends. And so the historical issue aside, these are our deeper roots of human value. I want to ask you about, but before we go there, anything you want to add to this point before we...
yeah, there's just nowhere to go outside of the system itself. Yeah.
Okay, that's fair. Partly what I'm hoping we can do is just clarify for people. Here's the differences. Here's what's at stake. And then people can decide. Now, this conversation is going longer than I thought, but there's one more I want to push back on. Is that okay? You said you had enough time?
Yeah, please. Yeah,
all right, let's do it. So you talk about this in your book. I don't think it was in the article, unless if I missed it, I apologize. But you had a whole section on free will that I thought was fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
And I want to read.
All right, it looks like they're moving on and talking about free will, which we can leave that for another discussion. And it doesn't look like we're going to get an answer to the question as to what it means for humans to be made in the image of God. That's what I was looking for there. It's possible that it's in the last half hour. Look, if I've missed it, let me know in the comments and I'll address it in another video, but I'm going to leave it there for this evening. Yeah, look, it's disappointing. I think that, well, I say it's disappointing. I'm actually not really surprised at the quality of the discussion. I think it was quite poor, which is interesting because in the comments, a lot of people are saying that this is like a really good discussion. I mean, it was cordial, right? Which I would have expected between these two. So it's nice in the sense it's not a shouting match, or it's not literally just two people talking past each other, although it sort of was in some ways, but I mean, I've seen worse. Yeah, I see sort of people in the comments talking, wonderful conversation. Rare to find such an intelligent conversation. Appreciated the level of civility. This is where the civility porn sort of thing comes in, which I sort of annoyed at. We don't need to keep talking about it. Just sort of be civil, but also be sharp in your disagreements, is what I think. But anyway, Turkic, Turkic, fill the Shermer with ease. Well, Turk's he's very much bottomed here. I'm amazed at Shermer's worldview, recognizes morality, laws of nature, yet still believes you're a product of random choice and nothingness. Well, this is where people have just completely failed to understand what Shermer is trying to articulate, which partly is Shermer's fault because he's not that great at articulating it. But I think at least throughout the discussion, you should have been able to get enough about what he thinks to understand that he doesn't think that it matters ultimately where we came from. It matters what we are, right? This is the idea that human nature grounds moral status, and it doesn't matter whether human nature came from evolution or from God. Like, it's actually the way we are. And to be honest, this is what it means to believe, in my view, in intrinsic human value. It's to say, look at the way a human is. That is what gives them value. Not look at where they came from, or that they're in the image of something else, or that someone commanded something. Look, none of those are relational, right? They're about a relation of humans and something outside of us. That's to not believe in intrinsic value. I really wish more moral realists, like atheistic moral realists, would make this point, or really anti-realists as well. Like, just make the point that many of these Christians, particularly in this sort of theological voluntarist Protestant tradition, they don't actually believe in intrinsic human value. They say that they do, but they don't actually. Like, when you ask what does intrinsic mean, and then they're pointing to things that are outside of humans, that's not intrinsic, right? Anyway, so it's disappointing that people think this is a good discussion, which I think is quite a bad discussion, judged by its alleged purpose of assessing what better explains morality. I don't think it did a good job of that at all. And it's also disappointing to see that there are people here who completely misunderstand, I think, what Shermer was advocating for. Yep, and I think that this sort of, this comment here is sort of sums it up quite well. Sean confuses a Judeo-Christian grounding with saying nothing on how it is grounded. Yeah, so consistently, Sean just says that his view is the Judeo-Christian view, but doesn't actually explain or attempt to justify that view, why we should believe it, and then ignoring that he's requiring much more from Shermer, which he himself is willing to engage with. Yeah, he requires Shermer to give justifications here, but why does human nature or evolution ground morality, and why should we think that humans have objective moral values, and why do we think that there's such things as human rights and so forth? While he himself simply says Christians have always thought this, and it's part of my worldview, as if that's some kind of response. Very disappointing to hear that. The engagement with the Euthyphro dilemma was very superficial, so that was disappointing. We didn't really get a discussion of what it means to be made in the image of God, which is disappointing. Shermer was not very good at articulating a moral naturalist view, and he sort of equivocated, in my opinion, between saying that values are grounded in human nature and evolution versus values are grounded in intersubjective agreements about how we think people should be treated. And those are really quite different views. You could make some connections between them, but I just don't think he was good at that. He tends to ramble and then talk about historical and social political issues quite superficially, I might add. Though I will say occasionally he did bring up some good points, and I agreed with him when he did. I actually think both of them did bring up some good points at times, but it's just overall that they didn't engage very well with each other's ideas or defend their views very clearly or in any much of any depth. So there wasn't really much of an engagement there. Overall, you won't really learn much of anything about metaethics from listening to this. A few ideas here. There was some decent discussion of the is-ought gap, and ironically, Michael Shermer himself started by saying that there is no such gap, or that it's a fallacy. And then he read a quote from a philosopher which articulated the issue brilliantly, which completely contradicted what Shermer had said. And then he just somehow moved on from that, which was utterly bizarre. I don't really understand what happened there. So we did get some good information about the is-ought sort of gap and what that actually means, that it's really a constraint on the type of arguments you give. And it's not really an argument against ethical naturalism or moral realism more generally, and also that it applies equally to the theist and the non-theist as well. It's not a specific problem for the non-theist, but it is a useful thing to bear in mind when we're thinking about how to make arguments and how to do metaethics. So there was some value there, but that's probably the most I got out of the discussion. Just having a quick look at comments here. Yeah, thanks everyone who's contributed. So I've done some videos on morality in the past and ethics, and I have a chapter in my book where I talk about this. I don't have my book on me, so I can't wave it to you, but check that out. I present what I think is quite a good critique of William Lane Craig's moral argument, where I discuss many of these issues. Craig does a bit of a better job at engaging with some of these issues than McDowell has done, although that's over more time and papers and things, so on balance, it's probably not that much different. There's often an extremely superficial level of engagement with metaethics on behalf of many of these religious apologists, and I think this actually matters a lot because the moral issue does seem to be one that, look at C.S. Lewis, for example, where many people actually do take that seriously as a reason for becoming a theist. Whether you're a moral realist or an anti-realist, I think that we can both agree that that's, well, not everyone watching may agree, but as atheist, in that sense, we would agree that that's not a good reason for becoming a theist, right? And so we should hold the discussion to a higher standard and demand that the theists properly defend their metaethical theories and hold them to the same standard that they hold the atheists to, and show the problems with the way that they defend morality, and really try to elevate the discussion properly, and so that we can really engage with these issues and not just trade thought terminating cliches like this is always what Christians have thought and it's built into our worldview, and we believe in intrinsic moral value because of the humans made in the image of God, and then these sorts of things that don't actually explain anything. Yeah, so this was not a very good discussion. If McDowell, or Shermer for that matter, but I think McDowell's more likely, would like to talk to me about this, I'd be very happy to. It's one of one of the areas I'm particularly interested in apologetics is the whole issue of ethical naturalism and effective altruism, which is a movement that I am involved in. Obviously has pretty strong normative underpinning itself, and so it's sort of important to a lot of the things that I do, thinking about morality and ethics and grounding and then living that out practically. So yeah, happy to talk about this, and hopefully you found this analysis interesting or valuable in thinking about it, regardless of where you particularly stand. The meta point that I make is that we need to do this seriously and address these questions seriously, and make sure that we try to actually articulate that view clearly and then give reasons for it, not to sort of misunderstand other people's views and then critique them based on straw man or having double standards. So that's sort of the meta point there. Got to wear a business suit and have a bookcase first. Well, I do have a bookcase. I just don't have it here because I'm at an Airbnb instead of my home. And yeah, I as for wearing a suit, well, it could happen, but it's maybe not my style. You can do a beanie with a suit, but it's a bit of a strange look. Yeah, the point about science explaining morality I mentioned at the start doesn't really make any sense, because in the description here it says, can morality be explained by God? Which is a different question to, is it better explained by God or science? And Shermer wasn't even really saying that morality is explained by science, narrowly understood, and he did clarify this later, that he just sort of means all human inquiry, right? But anyway, I think it's honestly just kind of a clickbaity title, like God or science. It's sort of, particularly the apologists like that sort of dichotomy. Anyway, yeah, I agree with that. That's a sort of a silly title. All right, thanks everyone. Hope you found that interesting. Take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye.